Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. Last summer, some friends and I decided to go camping in the Ozark Mountains. We wanted a break from the city and thought a few nights in the wilderness would be perfect. There were 5 of us: Mike, Sarah, Jake, Lisa, and me. We set up camp in a secluded spot, far from any trails. The first day was great. We hiked, swam in a nearby creek, and cooked dinner over a campfire. By nightfall, we were exhausted and went to bed early. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. It was pitch black and dead quiet, except for the usual sounds of the forest. I looked around our campsite and noticed something strange. Mike, Sarah, Jake, and Lisa were all gone. Their sleeping bags were empty, and there was no sign of them. Panic started to set in. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around, hoping to see them coming back from a late-night bathroom break or something. But the light caught something else. There were figures, at least 6 of them, standing at the edge of our campsite. They were armed with rifles and wore dark clothes. My heart pounded in my chest. I froze, not sure what to do. One of the men stepped forward and told me to stay quiet. His voice was cold and calm. I didn't recognize him, and he didn't look like he belonged to any search and rescue team. He told me to get up slowly and follow him. I had no choice. I got out of my sleeping bag, trying not to make any sudden moves. The other men surrounded me, their rifles pointed at me. They led me away from the campsite, deeper into the woods. We walked for what felt like hours, but it was probably only about 20 minutes. They took me to a small clearing where there was an old, beat-up van. They opened the back doors, and inside I saw Mike, Sarah, Jake, and Lisa. They were tied up and gagged. Relief washed over me for a second, knowing they were alive, but then fear took over again. They shoved me into the van and tied my hands behind my back. One of the men stayed in the back with us while the others got into the front and started driving. The man in the back kept his rifle trained on us, his eyes cold and hard. No one spoke. The tension was thick, and my mind raced with thoughts of what they wanted and where they were taking us. I tried to think of a way out, but with my hands tied and a rifle pointed at us, there was nothing I could do. After what felt like hours, the van finally stopped. They dragged us out and led us into a small, abandoned cabin. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years. They tied us to chairs and then left us alone, locking the door behind them. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no way to escape. We sat in silence, listening to the men talking outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't sound good. Every minute felt like an hour. My mind kept going to dark places, imagining the worst. Eventually, one of the men came back in. He looked at us and smirked. He told us we were going to be fine if we just did as we were told. He didn't say what that meant, but his tone made it clear that not obeying was not an option. Hours passed, maybe even a full day. We had no sense of time. They didn't feed us or give us any water. My mouth was dry, and my stomach was in knots. All we could do was wait and hope for a chance to escape. Then, late in the night, we heard yelling outside. It sounded like a fight had broken out among the men. This was our chance. Somehow, in the chaos, they had left the door unlocked. Mike managed to free himself and then the rest of us. We were shaky and scared, but we knew we had to move fast. We slipped out of the cabin and ran into the woods. We didn't know where we were going, just that we needed to get as far away as possible. We could hear the men shouting behind us, but the darkness was on our side. We stumbled through the forest, tripping over roots and branches, but we didn't stop. Eventually, we found a small creek and followed it. We hoped it would lead us to safety. After what felt like hours, we saw lights ahead. We stumbled into a small campsite where a family was vacationing. They looked at us, confused and scared, but when they saw our condition, they quickly called for help. The authorities arrived, and we told them everything. They searched the area but didn't find the men or the cabin. We were taken to a nearby town, given food and water, and eventually reunited with our families. The police continued their search, but as far as I know, they never found those men. I still think about that night often. The fear, the helplessness, it's all still so vivid. I was driving through the Canadian Rockies, enjoying the solitude and the breathtaking scenery. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just me and the open road. The mountains were covered in snow, and the trees looked like they were straight out of a postcard. The roads were mostly empty, which was perfect for clearing my mind. It was late afternoon when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb out. He was bundled up against the cold, looking desperate. I hesitated for a moment, but then I decided to stop. It was freezing, and I couldn't just leave him out there. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" I asked. He nodded, looking relieved. "Yes, please. Thank you so much." I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with a rugged look. His clothes were dirty and worn, like he'd been on the road for a while. "Where are you headed?" I asked as we started moving again. "Just up the road a bit," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Anywhere is fine, really. I just need to get out of the cold." We drove in silence for a while. He kept looking out the window, glancing back at the road behind us every few minutes. Something about his behavior put me on edge. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After about an hour, we reached a small gas station. I needed to fill up, so I pulled in. As I got out to pump the gas, I noticed a police car parked at the edge of the lot. The officer inside was watching us. My passenger saw it too and tensed up. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded quickly. "Yeah, just not a fan of cops." I paid for the gas and we got back on the road. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the snow. My passenger seemed more anxious now, fidgeting in his seat. I could feel the tension growing between us. Suddenly, he turned to me. "I need you to keep driving, no matter what. Don't stop for anything." "What's going on?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "Just do it," he insisted, his voice rising. "Please." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. A few minutes later, I saw the flashing lights of a police car in my rearview mirror. The officer was signaling for us to pull over. My passenger's face went pale. "Drive," he shouted. "Don't stop." Panic surged through me, but I didn't want any trouble with the law. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. The police car stopped behind us, and the officer got out, hand on his gun. My passenger's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. "No," he yelled. "Go." In a split second, I made the decision to hit the gas. The car lurched forward, tires squealing on the icy road. The police car followed, lights and sirens blaring. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sped down the highway, the cop close behind. "Why are they after you?" I shouted over the noise. "Just keep driving," he screamed back. The chase went on for what felt like forever. We weaved through the mountains, the police car never far behind. My passenger was shouting directions, telling me where to turn, trying to lose the cop. The roads were getting narrower, more treacherous. Finally, we hit a stretch of road that was barely more than a dirt path. The police car fell back, unable to keep up on the rough terrain. I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. When I was sure we had lost him, I slowed down and pulled over. "Now tell me what's going on," I demanded, turning to face him. He looked defeated, slumping in his seat. "I'm wanted," he admitted. "I escaped from a prison transport. They were taking me to a high-security facility. I couldn't let them lock me up for something I didn't do." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You're a fugitive." He nodded. "I didn't kill anyone. They framed me. I was trying to get to a friend's place. He has evidence that can clear my name." I didn't know if I could believe him, but something in his eyes made me want to trust him. I was in too deep now. I had to see this through. "Where do we go from here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Keep driving," he said. "I'll tell you where to go." We drove through the night, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see the flashing lights of a police car any minute. But the road remained dark and empty. By morning, we reached a small cabin tucked away in the woods. My passenger directed me to pull up behind it, out of sight from the road. We got out, and he led me inside. The place was a mess, but it looked like someone had been living there. "Wait here," he said. "I need to make a call." He disappeared into another room, leaving me alone. I sat on the edge of a worn-out couch, my mind racing. What had I gotten myself into? I was harboring a fugitive. If the police found us, I'd be in just as much trouble as he was. After what felt like an eternity, he came back, a relieved look on his face. "My friend is coming to get us. He's bringing the evidence. We just need to stay hidden until then." Hours passed. The sun was high in the sky when we heard the sound of a car approaching. My heart leaped into my throat. He peeked out the window and nodded. "It's him." A man got out of the car, carrying a briefcase. He looked around nervously before hurrying to the door. My passenger let him in, and they embraced like old friends. "You made it," the newcomer said. "I've got everything we need." They opened the briefcase, revealing stacks of papers and a laptop. They started going through the documents, talking in hushed tones. I watched, feeling like an outsider in my own nightmare. Finally, they turned to me. "We're going to send this to the media," my passenger said. "Once it's out there, they can't ignore the truth. We need your help." I agreed, not knowing what else to do. They worked quickly, scanning documents and sending emails. The sun was setting again by the time they were finished. "We have to move," the friend said. "It won't be long before they find us here." We packed up and got back in the car. My passenger sat beside me, the friend in the back. We drove in silence, the weight of what we were doing pressing down on us. We reached a small town just as night fell, finding a cheap motel to hide out in. The next few days were a blur. The story broke, and it was everywhere. The evidence proved my passenger's innocence. The police were looking for us, but now they were on our side. We were heroes, but I felt like I had barely survived a nightmare. When it was over, and he was cleared, he thanked me. "You saved my life," he said. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I had done what I thought was right, and in the end, it had all worked out. But I knew I would never forget those terrifying days on the run, and the man who had dragged me into his desperate fight for freedom. I agreed to house sit for a friend in the Hamptons. It was a huge mansion, isolated from the rest of the town, surrounded by woods. I thought it would be a relaxing break from my routine. The house had everything you could ask for: a pool, a huge kitchen, and even a home theater. It seemed like the perfect getaway. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time lounging by the pool, reading, and exploring the house. It was a bit too quiet at times, but I enjoyed the solitude. Every night, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows. The house was so big, it took almost 15 minutes to do a full check. On the third night, I was woken up by a noise. It sounded like something scratching against the wall. I brushed it off as an animal outside and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found the back door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I checked the house but didn't find anything missing or out of place. That night, I double-checked every door and window before going to bed. I lay awake for a while, listening for any sounds. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the same scratching noise, this time coming from downstairs. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed down the stairs, using the flashlight to guide my way. The noise led me to the kitchen. I scanned the room with the flashlight and saw nothing unusual. As I turned to leave, I heard a creak from the pantry. I slowly opened the door, and nothing was there. Feeling a bit foolish, I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I found footprints in the mudroom. They weren't mine. Panic set in. Someone had been in the house. I called my friend to ask if anyone else had access to the house, but she assured me that no one should be there. She suggested I call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? I had no proof other than my own fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, sitting in the living room with all the lights on. Around midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I heard footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, explaining that someone was in the house. She told me to stay on the line and hide. I crept into the small closet under the stairs, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps came closer, and I could hear someone moving around in the living room. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring me that help was on the way. Minutes felt like hours. I heard the intruder moving through the house, opening doors and drawers. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. I waited, holding my breath, until I heard the police call out. They found me in the closet and escorted me outside. They searched the house but didn't find anyone. However, they did find signs of forced entry at the back door. Whoever it was had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. The police advised me to stay somewhere else, but I didn't have many options. My friend arranged for a security company to come and install cameras and alarms the next day. I spent the night at a nearby hotel, unable to sleep, replaying the events in my mind. The rest of my time in the Hamptons was uneventful, but I never felt safe again in that house. Every creaking shadow made me jump. When my friend returned, she thanked me and apologized for what happened. I was relieved to leave and promised myself I'd never house sit in such an isolated place again. Looking back, I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and called for help. It could have ended much worse. That summer taught me to always be cautious, no matter how safe a place might seem. I was working as a lifeguard at a beach in Florida last summer. It was a hot day, and the beach was crowded with families. The sun was shining, kids were playing in the sand, and people were swimming in the clear blue water. It seemed like just another typical day. Around midday, I noticed a group of men sitting on the beach. There were 4 of them, all in their late 30s or early 40s. They looked out of place. While everyone else was enjoying the sun or splashing in the water, these men were just sitting there, not talking much, just watching. At first, I thought they might just be friends hanging out, but something felt off. They weren't looking at the ocean or the scenery. They were watching the children. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but I couldn't. I kept an eye on them, pretending to scan the beach as part of my usual routine. As the day went on, their behavior got stranger. They would whisper to each other, point subtly, and then split up, each man taking a different position around the beach. It was like they were forming a perimeter. My heart started to race. I had never seen anything like this before. I decided to get a closer look, so I walked down the beach, making it seem like I was just patrolling. When I got near one of the men, he glanced at me, then quickly looked away. I tried to stay calm, but the look in his eyes was chilling. It was like he knew I was onto him. I went back to my lifeguard stand and grabbed my binoculars. I scanned the beach, focusing on the men. They were definitely watching the kids. One of them even had a camera, pretending to take pictures of the ocean but clearly aiming it at the children. My stomach churned. I needed to do something, but I wasn't sure what. I couldn't just accuse them without proof. I decided to call the beach security. I explained what I had seen and my concerns. They said they would send someone over to check it out, but I could tell they weren't taking it as seriously as I was. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I kept my eyes on the men, my heart pounding. They were getting bolder, moving closer to the kids. I saw one of them approach a group of children playing by the water. He knelt down, pretending to be friendly, talking to them. The kids didn't seem to sense any danger. Finally, I saw the security officer approaching. I waved him over and pointed out the men. He nodded and started walking towards them. As he got closer, the men noticed and began to scatter. My pulse quickened. They were trying to get away. The security officer managed to stop one of them, asking questions. The man was calm, too calm, like he had done this before. The other 3 were moving quickly, heading towards the parking lot. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my whistle and blew it, loud and sharp, to get everyone's attention. People looked up, startled. I shouted, "Watch your children. There are men trying to take them." Parents immediately gathered their kids, pulling them close. The beach was in chaos. The security officer called for backup, and more guards arrived. They managed to catch 2 of the other men before they reached their cars. The last one got away, running into the nearby streets. The police were called, and soon the beach was swarming with officers. The men were arrested and taken away. I later found out they were part of a child trafficking ring. The police said my quick thinking might have saved several children that day. It was a terrifying experience, and I couldn't shake the image of those men watching the kids. I was praised for my actions, but it didn't feel like enough. The thought of what could have happened still haunts me. I'm more vigilant now, always watching, always ready. That day changed me forever. I'm grateful those children were safe, but I know there are others out there who might not be so lucky. I needed to clear my head and just drive, see where the roads would take me. I had everything packed in my old car: clothes, snacks, a few books, and a tent in case I wanted to camp out somewhere. I loved the freedom of the open road, the endless possibilities. After a long day of driving through the Arizona desert, the sun was setting, and I started looking for a place to stay. I was tired and didn't want to set up the tent. I saw a sign for a motel just off the highway. It looked old but decent enough for one night. I pulled in and went to the office. The man behind the counter, who I assumed was the owner, smiled too much. His name tag said Sam. He looked me up and down before handing me the key to room 7. The whole place had a weird vibe, but I was too tired to care. I thanked him and headed to my room. The room was small and smelled musty. I tried to ignore it and settled in, locking the door and double-checking the windows. After a quick shower, I lay on the bed, scrolling through my phone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard voices, hushed but urgent. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. There were 2 men talking near a van parked a few rooms down. One of them was Sam. They were looking at something in the back of the van, but I couldn't see what. My heart started racing. I decided to stay awake and keep an eye out. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening. The voices faded, but my unease didn't. I was about to try and get some sleep when I heard footsteps approaching my door. My stomach dropped. There was a soft knock, followed by Sam's voice. "Everything okay in there?" he asked. I didn't respond. He knocked again, louder this time. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable," he said, his voice almost mocking. I held my breath, praying he would go away. After what felt like an eternity, he did. I heard him mutter something before his footsteps retreated. I waited a few minutes, then quickly packed my things. I needed to get out of there. Just as I was about to unlock the door, I heard a scraping sound coming from the window. I turned and saw a man trying to pry it open. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering my location and the situation. The operator told me to stay on the line and find a place to hide. I shoved the dresser against the door and crawled under the bed, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The window finally gave way, and I heard the man climb in. He moved slowly, his footsteps heavy on the old carpet. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. He walked around the room, opening drawers and looking under the bed next to mine. I watched his feet through the gap, praying he wouldn't check my side. He stopped right in front of me, and I held my breath. Then, suddenly, he turned and left. I heard him talking to someone outside. I stayed under the bed until I heard the sirens. The relief was overwhelming. The police arrived and found me still hiding. They caught Sam and his accomplice trying to flee. The officers told me that the motel was a front for a human trafficking ring. They had been watching the place for weeks but hadn't expected to find someone in immediate danger. I gave my statement and was taken to a safe place for the night. The next day, I continued my road trip, but I was more cautious, more aware of the places I chose to stay. That night haunted me for a long time. The fear, the close call, it all felt too real, too raw. But I was alive, and for that, I was grateful. I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. I had an old camper van and thought it would be perfect for some stealth camping. I chose a spot near an abandoned mining town in Nevada. The idea of exploring the ghost town during the day and enjoying the quiet nights sounded appealing. I arrived in the late afternoon and found a secluded spot to park my van, well hidden from any potential passers-by. The mining town was about a mile away, visible in the distance. I set up a small campfire, cooked some dinner, and settled in to enjoy the solitude. The desert air was cool, and the sky was incredibly clear. Stars blanketed the night, making me feel both insignificant and connected to something greater. After dinner, I decided to take a short walk around the area before turning in. As I wandered, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No sounds of animals or insects, just the occasional rustling of the wind through the sparse vegetation. It made me uneasy, but I shook it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. I returned to the van, locked the doors, and settled into my sleeping bag. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the van. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the steps were too deliberate. My heart started pounding. I stayed still, listening, hoping it would go away. The footsteps circled the van, and then there was a light tapping on the window. I held my breath, afraid to make any noise. After a few moments, the tapping stopped, but the footsteps continued. I decided to peek out the window to see what was happening. I saw a man standing a few feet away from the van, looking around as if searching for something. He was disheveled, with wild hair and dirty clothes. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder. Fear gripped me. Who was he, and what did he want? I ducked back down, hoping he hadn't seen me. The footsteps moved closer again, and I heard him muttering to himself. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but his tone was angry and paranoid. I needed to figure out what to do. If I stayed in the van, he might break in. If I tried to drive away, he might shoot. The man started knocking on the van's door, harder this time. "I know you're in there," he said. "Come out and show yourself." I had no choice. I had to confront him. I grabbed the small camping knife I kept for emergencies and slowly opened the door, keeping the knife hidden behind my back. The man stepped back, eyeing me suspiciously. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Are you spying on me?" "No, I'm just camping," I said, trying to sound calm. "I didn't know anyone else was out here." "Liar," he spat. "You're with the government, aren't you? Sent to check up on me?" "I'm not with the government," I insisted. "I'm just a traveler." I swear. He didn't believe me. He raised the rifle, pointing it directly at me. My mind raced, trying to think of a way to de-escalate the situation. "Please," I said, "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I can leave right now if you want." "You're not going anywhere until I know the truth," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "Get out of the van." I slowly stepped out, keeping my hands visible. The man motioned for me to move away from the van. I complied, my heart pounding in my chest. He followed me, keeping the rifle trained on me. "Why are you really here?" he demanded again. "I told you, I'm just camping," I said. I didn't mean to intrude. He looked me over, his eyes wild with suspicion. "Prove it." I didn't know how to prove I wasn't a spy. My mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, that would convince him. Then I remembered my camera in the van, filled with pictures from my trip. "I have a camera," I said. "I can show you my photos. They're just landscapes and the old mining town. Nothing else." He hesitated, then nodded. "Get it." Slowly. I walked back to the van, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. I retrieved the camera and handed it to him, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. He flipped through the photos, his expression softening slightly. "These are just pictures," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He lowered the rifle a bit but kept it ready. "But that doesn't mean you're not lying." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I'm not lying. I swear. I'm just passing through." He seemed to be considering this, but the paranoia in his eyes remained. "If you're lying, I'll find out," he said. "And you won't like what happens." "I understand," I said, trying to sound as sincere as possible. "I just want to leave peacefully." He stepped back, still eyeing me warily. "Get in your van and go. If I see you again, it'll be the last time." I didn't need to be told twice. I climbed back into the van, started the engine, and drove off, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't look back until I was sure I was far enough away. The man's figure disappeared into the darkness. I drove until I reached a small town, finding a motel to spend the night. I couldn't shake the encounter from my mind. The fear and tension stayed with me, making sleep impossible. I realized how close I had come to a potentially deadly situation. The next morning, I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they seemed indifferent. The area was known for attracting drifters and people looking to stay off the grid. They took my statement but didn't seem inclined to investigate further. I decided to cut my trip short and head home. The thrill of adventure had been replaced by a lingering sense of dread. The memory of that wild-eyed man and his accusations haunted me. I didn't want to risk another encounter like that. Back home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of not being safe. It took weeks before I could relax again. I volunteered at a summer camp in Maine. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by thick forests and a large, clear lake. I had always loved working with kids, and this seemed like a perfect way to spend my summer. The camp was full of laughter and excitement, with activities like swimming, hiking, and arts and crafts. The first week went smoothly. I got to know the other counselors and bonded with the kids in my group. There was one staff member, Tom, who stood out. He was in his late 30s, quiet, and always seemed a bit off. He was responsible for maintenance and often kept to himself, but I noticed him watching the kids a little too closely at times. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just shy or awkward. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I went to the staff lounge to unwind. I overheard a conversation between Tom and another counselor, Sarah. She was asking him why he spent so much time near the kids' cabins. His answers were vague and dismissive, saying he was just doing his job. Sarah looked uncomfortable but didn't press further. The next day, I noticed Tom hanging around the arts and crafts area, even though he had no reason to be there. He kept glancing at the kids, especially the younger ones. I felt uneasy and decided to keep an eye on him. During lunch, I saw him slip something into his pocket from the kitchen. It looked like a small bottle, but I couldn't tell what it was. I mentioned it to the camp director, who brushed it off, saying Tom was just doing his job. That evening, I found a note in my cabin. It was from Sarah, asking me to meet her by the lake after lights out. When I got there, she looked scared. She told me she had found some disturbing things in Tom's cabin, maps of the camp with marks around the kids' cabins, a stash of small bottles like the one I saw him take, and a journal with notes about the kids. We knew we had to do something, but we couldn't go to the camp director without more proof. We decided to keep watch that night. Around midnight, we saw Tom sneaking around the cabins. He was carrying a backpack and looked like he was trying to stay hidden. We followed him at a distance, staying as quiet as possible. He went to the cabin where the youngest kids were sleeping. My heart was pounding. Sarah and I exchanged a look and decided to confront him. As we approached, we saw him take one of the bottles out of his backpack and pour the contents into a water bottle in the cabin. That was it, we had to stop him. We stepped out from behind the trees and called his name. He jumped and dropped the bottle, which shattered on the ground. Tom tried to make up an excuse, saying he was just checking on the kids, but we didn't believe him. Sarah grabbed the water bottle he had tampered with, and I told him we were going to the camp director. Tom's demeanor changed instantly. He lunged at Sarah, trying to grab the bottle. I screamed for help, hoping someone would hear us. We struggled with him, and he managed to knock the bottle out of Sarah's hand, but not before I had taken a picture of it with my phone. Just then, a few other counselors who had heard the commotion came running. Tom realized he was outnumbered and tried to run, but they tackled him and held him down until the camp director arrived. We explained everything and showed the picture as proof. The director called the police. The police arrived and took Tom away. They searched his cabin and found more evidence of his plans. It turned out he had a history of mental illness and had been off his medication. The bottles contained sedatives, and he had intended to drug the kids. The rest of the summer was tense, but we tried to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. The camp director increased security, and we all kept a closer eye on everything. The kids never found out the full story, and we made sure they stayed safe and had fun. By the end of the summer, I was exhausted and still shaken by what had happened. I was just glad we had been able to stop Tom before he could hurt anyone. I was staying at a small, cheap hostel in Bangkok, trying to make my trip to Thailand as budget-friendly as possible. The place was run down but had a certain charm, with a common area where travelers would gather to share stories. That's where I met Sarah. Sarah seemed friendly and approachable, a fellow traveler from Australia. We clicked immediately, bonding over our love of adventure and exploring new places. She had been traveling through Southeast Asia for a few months and had lots of tips and recommendations. We decided to explore the city together, and I felt lucky to have found a travel buddy so quickly. We spent the next few days visiting temples, markets, and street food stalls. Sarah knew all the best spots, and it felt like having a personal tour guide. One evening, she suggested we visit a lesser-known night market outside the tourist areas. She said it was a hidden gem, with the best food and unique souvenirs. We took a tuk-tuk to the market, and as we wandered through the stalls, I noticed it was much quieter than the bustling markets in the city center. Sarah led the way, guiding me through narrow alleys until we reached a small, dimly lit bar. She suggested we go in for a drink, and though I was a bit hesitant, I followed her. The bar was nearly empty, just a few locals and a couple of other foreigners. We sat at a table near the back, and Sarah ordered drinks for us. As we chatted, I started feeling a bit lightheaded. I chalked it up to the heat and the long day of walking, but then my vision began to blur. I looked at Sarah, trying to tell her something was wrong, but she just smiled and kept talking. My head felt heavy, and I struggled to stay awake. I realized too late that something was very wrong. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Sarah's cold, calculating expression. When I woke up, I was in a dark, cold room. My hands and feet were tied, and my head was pounding. Panic set in as I tried to remember what happened. I could hear muffled voices outside the door, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. The door creaked open, and a man stepped in, his face hidden in shadows. He spoke to me in broken English, telling me to stay quiet and that everything would be over soon. My heart raced as I realized I had been kidnapped. I asked about Sarah, but the man just laughed and left the room. I spent what felt like hours in that room, fear gripping me with every passing minute. Eventually, the door opened again, and 2 men came in. They untied my feet and dragged me out into a dimly lit hallway. I was too weak to fight back, my body still recovering from whatever they had drugged me with. They led me into a larger room that looked like an old, abandoned medical facility. My stomach churned as I saw surgical equipment and bloodstains on the floor. I realized with horror that they were planning to harvest my organs. Desperation gave me a surge of strength. I struggled and screamed, trying to break free. One of the men punched me in the stomach, and I doubled over in pain. They strapped me to a table, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I couldn't believe this was happening. Just as they were preparing to sedate me again, I heard a commotion outside. Shouts and banging echoed through the building. The men exchanged worried glances, and one of them left the room to check what was happening. The remaining men hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. The door burst open, and a group of police officers stormed in. The man beside me tried to run, but he was quickly subdued. The officers untied me and helped me off the table, speaking calmly and reassuringly. They told me I was safe now, and that they had been tracking this organ trafficking ring for months. I was taken to a hospital, where I was treated for my injuries and monitored for any lasting effects of the drugs. The police explained that they had been tipped off by another traveler who had a close call with Sarah but managed to escape. They had been following her and finally found the hideout. Sarah and the men were arrested, and I was able to return home safely. The experience left me traumatized, and I struggled with nightmares for a long time. But I was grateful to be alive and determined to be more cautious in the future. Traveling is supposed to be about adventure and discovery, but I learned the hard way that not everyone you meet has good intentions. I'm still passionate about exploring the world, but now I'm much more careful about who I trust. I was on a road trip through Central Europe, driving alone through the Hungarian countryside. The scenery was beautiful, with rolling hills and fields stretching out as far as I could see. It was late afternoon, and I planned to reach Budapest by nightfall. I had been on the road for hours, and I was looking forward to a good meal and a bed. The road was nearly empty, with only the occasional car passing by. I felt a sense of calm, enjoying the solitude and the quiet. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and a cool breeze. I had the windows down, letting the fresh air fill the car. I noticed a van ahead, pulled over to the side of the road with its hazard lights on. As I got closer, I saw a man standing next to it, waving his arms. He looked distressed, and I felt a pang of concern. I slowed down and pulled over, figuring I could at least see if he needed help. I rolled down my window and asked if everything was okay. The man spoke quickly in Hungarian, which I didn't understand, but his tone was urgent. He gestured toward the van, and I saw a woman inside, holding a small child. I nodded and got out of the car, wanting to see if I could help. As soon as I stepped out, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. Everything went black for a moment, and when I came to, I was on the ground. I tried to get up, but my head was spinning. I saw 3 men standing around me, one of them holding a gun. They were speaking rapidly, their voices harsh and angry. One of the men grabbed me by the arm and dragged me to my feet. He pushed me against my car, and I felt the cold metal of the gun pressed against my back. I tried to speak, to tell them to take whatever they wanted, but my voice came out as a croak. The man with the gun barked an order, and one of the others rifled through my pockets, taking my wallet and phone. They shoved me into the back seat of my car and got in, with the man holding the gun sitting next to me. I could feel his eyes on me, the barrel of the gun pressed against my side. The car started moving, and I had no idea where they were taking me. I tried to stay calm, to think of a way out, but my mind was racing. The countryside blurred past the windows, and I felt a rising sense of panic. The men were talking to each other in low voices, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. After what felt like an eternity, the car pulled off the main road and onto a narrow, bumpy track. We drove for a few more minutes before coming to a stop in front of an old, abandoned farmhouse. They dragged me out of the car and pushed me inside, the door slamming shut behind us. The interior of the farmhouse was dark and musty, with broken furniture and debris scattered across the floor. They shoved me into a chair and tied my hands behind my back, the rope cutting into my wrists. One of the men stood guard while the others went through my belongings, taking anything of value. I could hear them arguing, their voices growing louder and more heated. I didn't know what they were saying, but it was clear they were not happy. The man with the gun glanced over at me, his eyes cold and calculating. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to do something, but I was terrified. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I remembered the Swiss Army knife I kept in the glove compartment of my car, and I hoped they hadn't found it. If I could just get to it, I might have a chance. The men seemed distracted, still arguing amongst themselves. I tested the ropes, trying to see if there was any give. They were tight, but I felt a slight looseness in one of the knots. I worked at it slowly, trying not to draw attention to myself. After what felt like hours, I managed to free one of my hands. I kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment. The men were still distracted, and I knew this was my only chance. I took a deep breath and sprang to my feet, shoving the chair into the man with the gun. He stumbled back, and I ran for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst outside and headed for the car, hoping they hadn't taken the keys. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I threw open the car door and reached into the glove compartment, my fingers closing around the knife. The men were almost on me, and I slashed wildly, keeping them at bay. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before catching traction. The car lurched forward, and I sped down the track, not daring to look back. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I kept driving, not caring where I was going, just wanting to put as much distance between me and those men as possible. The narrow track eventually led back to the main road, and I headed towards the nearest town, praying I would find help. I reached a small village and pulled into a gas station. The attendant looked up in surprise as I stumbled out of the car, my clothes torn and bloodied. I managed to explain what had happened, and he called the police. The police arrived quickly, and I gave them my statement. They assured me they would search for the men, but I could tell they didn't hold out much hope. They arranged for a tow truck to take my car, and one of the officers gave me a ride to a nearby hotel. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The events of the day replayed in my mind. It's an experience I won't forget anytime soon. I had been looking forward to my fishing trip in the Alaskan wilderness for months. I needed a break from my hectic life, and there was something about the isolation and the challenge that appealed to me. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out to a remote spot I had found on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest and icy rivers. The first few days were perfect. The air was crisp, the scenery was stunning, and I had the river all to myself. I spent my days fishing and my nights by the campfire, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. I felt completely at peace. On the fourth day, I was fishing along a particularly quiet stretch of the river when I had the strange feeling that I was being watched. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Just trees and the river flowing by. I shrugged it off and kept fishing, but the feeling stayed with me. Later that evening, as I was cooking my dinner over the fire, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was out there. I called out, thinking maybe it was a lost hiker, but there was no answer. The rustling stopped, and everything went quiet again. I tried to shake off the unease and went to bed, but I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise seemed amplified, and I kept imagining someone lurking just beyond the light of my campfire. In the morning, I found fresh footprints around my campsite. They weren't mine. Someone had been here during the night, watching me. I decided to move my camp further up the river, hoping to get away from whoever was out there. I packed up my gear and hiked for a couple of hours until I found a new spot that seemed more secluded. I set up camp again and tried to put the previous night out of my mind. But the feeling of being watched returned. As I fished, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. That evening, I heard the rustling again, closer this time. I shone my flashlight into the trees and saw a figure dart behind a tree. It was a man, dirty and unkempt, with wild eyes. He looked like he had been living out here for a long time. I called out to him, asking if he needed help, but he just stared at me from behind the tree, not saying a word. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about his gaze was unnerving. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight on him, and went back to my camp. I didn't sleep at all that night, keeping my fire burning bright and my knife close at hand. In the morning, the man was gone, but his footprints were all around my camp. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my gear and started hiking back towards my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. I kept hearing twigs snapping and leaves rustling, but every time I turned around, I saw nothing. As I neared the spot where I had parked my truck, I saw the man again, standing in the middle of the path. He was holding a crude spear and had a crazed look in his eyes. I stopped, my heart pounding. He took a step towards me, raising the spear. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the cuts and scrapes I was getting from the branches. I could hear him chasing after me, his footsteps getting closer. I stumbled and fell, rolling down a small hill. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me, but I scrambled to my feet and kept running. I finally burst out onto the dirt road where my truck was parked. I jumped in, locking the doors behind me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and started the engine. As I sped away, I saw the man emerge from the trees, watching me with those wild eyes. I drove for hours until I reached the nearest town. I reported the encounter to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said there were a few hermits living out in the wilderness, but they usually kept to themselves. I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. That trip changed me. I used to love the idea of solitude and the wilderness, but now I can't shake the memory of those eyes watching me from the darkness. A couple of summers back, I decided to take a solo sailing trip in the Caribbean. I had been planning it for years, and it was finally happening. The idea of navigating the open waters, relying on my skills, and experiencing the beauty of the sea was a dream come true. My boat was small but well equipped, perfect for a solo journey. The first few days were perfect. The weather was sunny, and the sea was calm. I followed my planned route, stopping at small islands, enjoying the solitude and the stunning views. It felt like a true escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. On the fourth day, I noticed a boat in the distance. It was drifting, looking a bit out of place. As I got closer, I saw someone on board waving frantically. They looked distressed, and I felt a pang of concern. I decided to approach and see if they needed help. As I pulled up alongside their boat, a man shouted that their engine had died and they needed assistance. Something about the situation felt off, but I brushed it aside, thinking maybe I was being paranoid. I tied my boat to theirs and climbed aboard to see if I could help. The man seemed grateful at first, but then I noticed two other men emerging from below deck. They had a different look about them, rough and intense. My heart started pounding. I realized too late that I had made a terrible mistake. Before I could react, one of the men grabbed me from behind and forced me to sit down. The leader, the one who had waved me over, smirked and told me they were taking my boat. They were pirates, and they had been using the Distress Act to lure in unsuspecting sailors like me. They bound my hands and gagged me, then started transferring supplies from their boat to mine. I felt a mix of fear and anger. I had to find a way out of this. As they were distracted, I noticed a knife on the deck, not far from where I was sitting. I managed to shuffle over and grab the knife, hidden behind my back. My hands were shaking, but I started sawing at the rope. It was slow and painful, but I eventually freed myself. The pirates were busy looting my boat, so they didn't notice right away. When I was free, I waited for the right moment. As one of them passed by, I jumped up and slashed at him, more out of instinct than skill. He yelled in pain, and the others turned, giving me just enough time to dive overboard. I swam under the boat and surfaced on the other side, gasping for air. I knew I had to get to the nearby island, which wasn't too far. I started swimming, my heart pounding with every stroke. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. The swim felt like it took forever. I was exhausted, but fear kept me going. When I finally reached the island, I crawled onto the beach and hid behind some rocks, trying to catch my breath and calm down. I could see my boat in the distance, the pirates still on board, but they didn't seem to be looking for me anymore. I stayed hidden until nightfall. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. I knew I had to get my boat back or find another way to signal for help. The island seemed deserted, but I started exploring, hoping to find something useful. To my relief, I stumbled upon a small hut with a radio inside. It looked abandoned, but the radio still worked. I managed to send out a distress call, explaining my situation. After what felt like hours, I received a response. A nearby vessel had picked up my signal and was on its way. I stayed hidden in the hut until I saw the lights of the rescue boat approaching. I signaled them with a flashlight I found in the hut. They picked me up and, together, we approached my boat cautiously. The pirates, perhaps sensing trouble, had already fled. The rescue crew helped me secure my boat and check for any damages. I was shaken but incredibly relieved to be safe. They escorted me to the nearest port, where I reported the incident to the authorities. The rest of my trip was canceled. I couldn't shake off the fear and paranoia from that encounter. It took me a long time to feel safe on the water again. I had always loved camping, especially in remote places where you could really feel away from it all. This time, my friends and I decided to camp in a secluded area of the Adirondacks. We wanted a real adventure, away from the usual spots crowded with tourists. We set up our tents near a quiet lake surrounded by dense woods. The first couple of days were perfect, just us and nature. We hiked, fished, and enjoyed the peace. On the third night, we decided to split up to gather firewood before it got too dark. I wandered off, figuring I knew the area well enough. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me. I lost sight of the camp, but I wasn't worried. I had my flashlight and plenty of time to get back. After gathering a decent pile of wood, I realized it was getting darker faster than I expected. I turned to head back, but the forest seemed different. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing looked familiar. I kept walking, hoping to find a landmark, but it was like the woods were shifting around me. Panic started to set in. I yelled for my friends, but my voice seemed to vanish into the trees. After what felt like hours, I saw a small cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me. Maybe someone there could help. I approached the cabin, noticing it looked old and run down. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the door, and it creaked open. Inside, it was dark and smelled musty. I called out, but still no response. I was about to leave when I heard a noise behind me. I turned and saw a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with a wild look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. "I'm lost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you help me get back to my camp?" He didn't answer, just stepped closer. There was something off about him. His clothes were dirty, and he had a hunting knife strapped to his belt. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said, inching toward the door. "I'll just go." Before I could move, he lunged at me. I ducked and ran out the door, dropping the firewood. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. The woods were dark now, and every shadow seemed to hide him. I found a large tree and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath. I listened for any sign of him, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. After a while, I started moving again, slowly and quietly. I needed to find my way back to camp. I thought about my friends and hoped they were okay. The fear of that man kept me moving. I stumbled onto a narrow path and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead somewhere safe. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified he would appear out of the darkness. The path twisted and turned, and I felt like I was going in circles. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard voices. Familiar voices. I followed the sound and burst into a small clearing. There were my friends, gathered around a fire, looking worried. They jumped up when they saw me, bombarding me with questions. I tried to explain what happened, but I was too shaken to make much sense. All I knew was we had to leave, now. We quickly packed up our camp, not wanting to risk another encounter with the man. As we hiked out, I kept looking back, half expecting to see him watching us. The feeling of being hunted stayed with me long after we were safe. Back home, the experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of his wild eyes and the feeling of being trapped in those woods. Camping, something I once loved, now filled me with dread. I still think about that night and wonder who he was and what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. I'm grateful I got out, but the fear lingers, a reminder that sometimes the real danger is just a heartbeat away, hidden in the quiet places we least expect. I've been hunting in the deep woods of Montana for years, always alone. The silence of the forest and the thrill of the hunt give me peace. That morning, I left my cabin early, just as the sun was coming up. It was cold, my breath making little clouds in the air. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder and a pack with supplies. I was ready for a long day. By mid-morning, I was deep in the forest. I hadn't seen any game yet, but I wasn't worried. Sometimes it took hours of patience. I found a good spot on a ridge overlooking a clearing and settled in. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the call of birds. Around noon, I heard voices. That was strange because I'd never run into other hunters out here before. I stayed still, listening. The voices were getting closer, and they didn't sound friendly. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was an edge to their tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to move, figuring it was better to avoid any potential trouble. I packed up quietly and started down the ridge, staying low. As I made my way through the trees, I caught a glimpse of them, a group of 5 men, heavily armed. They weren't dressed like hunters. They had military-style gear and serious-looking rifles. I ducked behind a tree, my heart pounding. I was trying to figure out what to do when I heard one of them shout. I peeked out and saw one of the men pointing in my direction. They'd seen me. Panic shot through me. I started moving faster, trying to put distance between us. I heard them crashing through the underbrush, coming after me. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning and legs aching. The woods were dense, but I knew them well. I hoped that would give me an advantage. I could hear them yelling to each other, organizing a search pattern. They weren't going to give up easily. I found a small stream and waded into it, hoping to throw them off my trail. The cold water soaked my boots, but I kept going, following the stream until I found a place where it curved sharply. I climbed out and hid behind a cluster of rocks, catching my breath. I waited, listening. The voices faded a bit, and I dared to hope they'd lost me. But then, I heard a branch snap nearby. I froze. One of them was close. Too close. I held my rifle tightly, trying to stay calm. He appeared out of the trees, scanning the area. He had a hard look on his face, like he was ready to kill. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. He moved past me, his eyes sweeping the ground for tracks. I waited until he was a few yards away, then slowly backed away, moving as quietly as possible. I kept moving, trying to stay downwind and out of sight. The afternoon was wearing on, and I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I needed a plan. I decided to head for a spot I knew well, a small cave hidden in the rocks. It wasn't far, and it would give me some cover. It took me another hour to get there, moving carefully and listening for any sign of the men. When I finally reached the cave, I slipped inside and huddled in the darkness, exhausted. I could still hear them in the distance, but they seemed to be moving away. I hoped they thought I kept running. I stayed in the cave until nightfall, too scared to move. When it was completely dark, I crept out and started making my way back to my cabin. The forest was different at night, every sound magnified and every shadow a potential threat. I moved slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. It took me all night, but I finally made it back to my cabin just before dawn. I locked the door behind me and sank to the floor, shaking. I had never been so scared in my life. I didn't know who those men were or why they were out there, but I knew I had to get help. I radioed the nearest ranger station, telling them what had happened. They said they'd send someone out to check, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. It sounded crazy, like something out of a movie. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I wasn't safe. I packed up my things and left Montana that same day, heading back to the city. I don't know if they ever found those men or if they even looked. I haven't been back to those woods since. I parked my van deep in the woods of Maine, far from any town. I was looking forward to a weekend of solitude and nature. I had been planning this trip for months, wanting to escape the stress of work and the noise of the city. The forest was thick and quiet, the perfect place to unwind. The first day was peaceful. I set up camp, cooked dinner over a small fire, and spent the evening reading. As the sun set, the sounds of the forest grew louder. It was calming, listening to the rustling leaves and distant calls of animals. I felt completely alone, which was exactly what I wanted. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a hike. The air was crisp and fresh, and the scenery was beautiful. I took my time, enjoying the peace and quiet. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. That's when I noticed something odd. My van's door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left. I checked inside, but nothing seemed to be missing. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had been careless. But then I found a note on the driver's seat. It was a small piece of paper with just one word written on it: leave. My heart pounded as I looked around. There was no one in sight. I told myself it was probably just a prank, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I locked the doors and decided to stay alert. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept checking the locks, making sure everything was secure. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. In the morning, I found another note, this time on the windshield. It read, "You shouldn't be here." Fear gripped me. Someone was definitely messing with me. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to let some prankster ruin my trip. I decided to stay one more night and see if things got better. I spent the day trying to relax, but it was hard to shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the trees. The day passed slowly, and by evening, I was more on edge than ever. That night, I heard footsteps around my van. I lay still, listening. The footsteps stopped, and then there was a knock on the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Whoever it was, they were just outside. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away. I waited until morning to check outside. There were fresh footprints around my van, and another note, "Last warning." Panic set in. I knew I had to leave. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. As I started the engine, I heard a noise behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. I drove as fast as I could down the narrow, winding road. My mind raced with thoughts of who it could be and what they wanted. I didn't stop until I reached a small town miles away. I found a diner and sat there, trying to calm down. I called the local authorities and told them what happened. They took my statement but didn't seem very concerned. They said they would check the area, but I didn't feel reassured. I decided to cut my trip short and head home. The drive back was tense. Every car that passed made me jump. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure from the woods following me. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows and tried to forget about the whole thing. But I couldn't. The experience haunted me. I kept thinking about those notes, the footsteps, the figure in the clearing. I didn't know who it was or why they wanted me gone, but the fear stayed with me. I haven't been camping since. The woods, once a place of peace and solitude, now felt dangerous and threatening. I learned to trust my instincts and never ignore warning signs. The sense of being watched, the feeling of unease, it was all too real. I realized how vulnerable I was out there, alone in the wilderness. Now, I stick to more populated areas for my getaways. The fear of being followed and threatened is something I don't want to experience again. I was on a guided safari in South Africa, excited to see the wildlife up close. We were in a large group, riding in an open-top jeep, with our guide explaining the different animals and plants. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds and insects. I had my camera ready, hoping to capture some great shots. We stopped at a clearing to take some photos of a herd of elephants in the distance. Our guide told us to stay close, but I wandered a bit to get a better angle. I didn't realize how far I had gone until I couldn't hear the voices of the group anymore. When I turned around, the jeep was gone. Panic set in as I realized I was alone. I started walking in the direction I thought they had gone, but the landscape looked the same in every direction. The sun was beginning to set, and I knew I needed to find them before dark. My heart was pounding, and I felt the fear rising. I shouted for help, but there was no response. As I was walking, I heard voices. Relieved, I headed towards the sound, thinking I had found my group. But as I got closer, I realized these were not the voices of my fellow tourists. These were rough, angry voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. I crouched behind some bushes and peered through the leaves. I saw a group of men with rifles, standing around a jeep. They were talking heatedly and gesturing towards something on the ground. My blood ran cold when I saw the carcass of a rhinoceros, its horn sawed off. These were poachers, and they had just killed the animal. I knew I had to get away before they saw me. I started to back away slowly, but I stepped on a dry twig, and it snapped loudly. One of the men turned towards the sound. I froze, hoping he wouldn't see me. But he did. He shouted to the others, and they all looked in my direction. I bolted, running as fast as I could through the dense brush. I could hear them shouting and the sound of their footsteps behind me. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. I knew if they caught me, I wouldn't survive. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't stop. I spotted a large tree with low branches and scrambled up, hoping they wouldn't see me. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. The men ran past, not noticing me hidden in the foliage. I waited until I couldn't hear their voices anymore before climbing down. I knew I couldn't stay there. They would come back and find me. I started moving again, more cautiously this time. I kept to the shadows, trying to stay hidden. The sun had set completely, and the darkness made it even harder to navigate. I tripped over roots and rocks, my fear growing with each passing minute. Eventually, I heard the sound of running water. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to safety. I found a small stream and drank deeply, trying to calm my nerves. I sat by the water, trying to think of my next move. My mind was clouded with fear and exhaustion. As I sat there, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I looked around frantically, trying to find a place to hide. But it was too late. The poachers had found me. They surrounded me, their faces twisted with anger. One of them grabbed me by the arm and yanked me to my feet. He shouted something in my face, but I couldn't understand. He pointed his rifle at me, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I thought this was the end. But then, I heard another voice shouting in the distance. The poachers looked up, their expressions changing from anger to fear. I realized it was the voice of my guide, calling out for me. The poachers exchanged glances and then fled into the night. Moments later, my guide and the rest of the group burst through the trees. They were shouting my name, and I cried out in relief. The guide ran over to me, asking if I was okay. I was shaking, but I managed to nod. We made our way back to the jeep, and I couldn't stop shaking. The guide explained that they had noticed I was missing and had been searching for me. I told them about the poachers, and the guide reported it to the authorities. That night, back at the lodge, I couldn't sleep. The fear and adrenaline were still coursing through me. I kept thinking about how close I had come to not making it out alive. The experience had shaken me to my core. The authorities assured us they would investigate the poachers, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I was grateful to be safe, but I knew I would never forget the terror of that night in the South African wilderness. I decided to take a solo road trip through the Midwest. I wanted to clear my head, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. Everything was going well until my car broke down in a small town. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the sun was beating down hard. My engine just sputtered and died. I managed to pull over to the side of the road. The town seemed quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't see many people around, but I figured I'd just find a mechanic and get back on my way. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. Typical. So, I decided to walk into town and look for assistance. As I walked, I noticed the place had an eerie feel to it. The houses looked old and worn, like they hadn't been maintained in years. I finally saw a small garage with a sign that said Joe's Auto Repair. I walked in, and a man in greasy overalls looked up from under a car hood. "Car trouble?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, it just died on me," I replied. "Can you take a look?" "Sure thing," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He grabbed his tools and followed me back to my car. As he worked on it, I noticed a couple of other locals standing around, watching us. They were just standing there, not talking, just watching. It made me uneasy. After a while, Joe said he needed to tow the car to the garage to get a better look. He called over 2 other men to help. They hooked up my car and we all walked back to the garage. Joe started working on it, and I waited in a small office area. The 2 men from before stood outside, still watching me. After about an hour, Joe came back in. "Bad news," he said. "It's gonna take a few days to get the parts one need to fix it." I felt a knot in my stomach. "A few days? Is there any way to make it faster?" He shook his head. "Not unless you want to try your luck in another town, but that could be risky. Best to stay put." I didn't have much choice, so I agreed. Joe offered to put me up in a small room above the garage for the night. I was tired and didn't feel like arguing, so I accepted. The room was small and musty, but it had a bed and a bathroom. I locked the door and tried to relax. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, like footsteps and whispers. At one point, I thought I heard someone trying the doorknob. My heart raced, but eventually, the noises stopped. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I went downstairs, and Joe was already working on my car. He smiled when he saw me, but it still didn't feel right. I decided to take a walk and see if I could get a better signal on my phone. As I walked through the town, I noticed people watching me from their windows. It felt like every eye in the town was on me. I found a small diner and went in, hoping to get some food and maybe some information. The waitress seemed friendly enough, but when I asked about the town, she got nervous. She told me it was best to stick close to Joe's place and not wander around too much. I went back to the garage, feeling more uneasy than ever. Joe told me he was still waiting on parts and that it might be another day or 2. I nodded and went back to my room. That night was worse. I heard more noises, louder this time. Footsteps right outside my door, and once, I swear I heard someone whispering my name. I was too scared to sleep. I sat up in bed, clutching my phone, even though I knew I had no signal. When morning came, I was exhausted but determined to get out of there. I went downstairs, but Joe was gone. One of the other men from before was there, and he gave me a creepy smile. Joe had to step out. Said he'd be back later, he said. I didn't believe him, but I nodded and went back outside. I decided to take my chances and try to find a way out of town on foot. As I walked, I felt like I was being followed. I looked back and saw a few of the locals trailing behind me, just far enough to be unsettling. I picked up my pace, but so did they. I started to panic. I saw a small road leading out of town and started running. The men behind me started running too. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe, but I kept running. I finally saw a car coming down the road. I waved my arms and screamed for help. The car stopped, and an older couple inside asked what was wrong. I told them everything as quickly as I could, and they told me to get in. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the men standing at the edge of the town, watching us leave. The couple took me to the nearest town, and I called the police. They went back to investigate, but they didn't find anything unusual. Joe's garage was closed, and the town seemed deserted. No one knew where the locals had gone. I got my car fixed in the new town and continued my trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, I get chills thinking about it. I've never felt so scared in my life. I don't know what those people wanted, and I'm not sure I want to know. Last summer, I went to a music festival in California with a group of friends. It was supposed to be an amazing weekend, 3 days of music, camping, and fun. The first day was perfect. We set up our tents, danced to our favorite bands, and made a lot of memories. The crowd was huge, and it was easy to get lost in it, but we all stuck together. On the second day, things took a turn. In the afternoon, we were all at the main stage. The sun was blazing, and the music was loud. I remember we were dancing when I suddenly lost sight of my friends. It was packed, and I got pushed by the crowd. One moment they were there, the next they were gone. I tried to find them, but it was hopeless. I walked around for what felt like hours. I kept checking my phone, but there was no signal. I was getting more anxious by the minute. The sun started to set, and the crowd was getting rowdier. I felt alone and vulnerable. That's when a man approached me. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a friendly smile and a calm voice. He asked if I was okay. I told him I lost my friends and couldn't find them. He offered to help me look for them. At that moment, I was grateful. He seemed kind, and I didn't know what else to do. We walked together, weaving through the crowd. He kept talking, trying to keep me calm. He asked about my friends, what they looked like, and where I had last seen them. I answered all his questions, thinking he was just being helpful. But then he suggested we go to a quieter area where it would be easier to hear my phone if it rang. Something felt off, but I was too scared and desperate to find my friends to think straight. We left the main area and walked toward the edge of the festival grounds. The music was distant now, and the crowd was thinning out. We reached a secluded spot near some trees. He said we should wait there for a bit, that maybe my friends would try to call or text. I pulled out my phone again, hoping for a signal. That's when I noticed his demeanor change. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked at me with a strange intensity. He moved closer, too close. Alarm bells went off in my head, and I knew I needed to get away from him. I made an excuse about needing to use the restroom and started to walk away. He grabbed my arm, not hard, but enough to scare me. He said it wasn't safe for me to go alone and that he would come with me. My heart was racing. I pulled my arm free and told him I'd be quick. I walked away fast, trying not to run and draw attention. Once I was out of sight, I started running. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him. I found myself near the camping area, and I ducked behind a row of tents. I crouched down, trying to catch my breath and calm my nerves. I stayed hidden for a while, listening for any sign that he had followed me. It was dark now, and the festival lights were a faint glow in the distance. My phone finally picked up a signal, and I quickly texted my friends, telling them where I was and what had happened. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, I saw familiar faces. My friends found me and hugged me tightly. I broke down, telling them everything. They were shocked and angry that someone had taken advantage of the situation. We went to the festival security and reported the man. They took it seriously and said they would look for him. The rest of the festival was a blur. I couldn't relax or enjoy the music anymore. We stuck together like glue, never letting anyone out of sight. When it was over, I was relieved to go home. The experience left me shaken. I thought about how easily things could have gone worse. I haven't been to a festival since. The thought of getting lost in a crowd again terrifies me. The woods of Washington State seemed like the perfect spot for some stealth camping. I parked my van in a secluded area, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of nature. It was peaceful, serene even. But that tranquility didn't last long. As I settled in for the night, I heard footsteps approaching my van. At first, I thought it might be another camper passing by, but something about the sound seemed off. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I peered out the window and saw a figure emerging from the darkness. It was a hiker, or at least that's what they appeared to be. They wore a backpack and hiking gear, and they had a friendly smile on their face. But something about their demeanor set off alarm bells in my mind. I rolled down the window and greeted them cautiously, trying to mask my growing unease. They seemed friendly enough, striking up a conversation and asking about my camping trip. But as they talked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Their questions became more probing, more invasive, and I began to feel like I was being interrogated. They seemed too interested in my plans, too curious about where I was headed next. And when I tried to politely end the conversation and retreat back into my van, they grew agitated. Their smile turned into a menacing grin, and they took a step closer, blocking my path back inside. I could see the glint of something sharp in their hand, a knife gleaming in the moonlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the danger I was in. I tried to reason with them, to plead for mercy, but they just laughed in my face. They made it clear that they had violent intentions, that they saw me as nothing more than prey to be hunted. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the door of my van, slamming it shut behind me and locking it tight. But the hiker wasn't done yet. They began to pound on the windows, shouting threats and obscenities. I frantically searched for my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was nowhere to be found. I was trapped, alone and defenseless, with no way to escape. The hikers' pounding grew louder and more frenzied, and I knew that they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Desperate, I reached for anything I could use as a weapon, my hands closing around a heavy flashlight lying nearby. With trembling hands, I held it up as a makeshift defense, ready to fight for my life if necessary. But just as I prepared to defend myself, the pounding stopped. I held my breath, waiting for the hiker to make their next move. But instead of attacking, they simply turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me shaken but alive. I stayed locked inside my van until the first light of dawn, too afraid to venture back out into the woods. When morning finally came, I emerged cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of danger. But the hiker was gone, leaving no trace behind. I packed up my things quickly and drove away from the forest as fast as I could, vowing never to return to that cursed place again. Even now, as I write this post from the safety of my home, I can't shake the memory of that terrifying encounter. Working in the IT department of a skyscraper can be pretty routine. You spend most of your time fixing computer issues, troubleshooting network problems, and generally just keeping things running smoothly. But one night, things took a turn for the terrifying. I was working late, trying to track down the source of some strange network activity we had been noticing for a while. It was coming from an unused floor of the building, a floor that had been closed off for renovations for months. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just some glitch in the system, I thought. But as I dug deeper, I realized there was something more going on. The activity was too consistent, too deliberate to be just a glitch. Someone was using the network on that floor, and they were doing it with purpose. I debated calling security or the police, but I knew they wouldn't be able to do much without more information. I decided to investigate on my own, to see if I could figure out who or what was behind this strange activity. I made my way up to the unused floor, my heart pounding in my chest with every step. The floor was dark and empty, with rows of dusty cubicles lining the walls. It felt like something out of a horror movie, the kind where you know something bad is about to happen. I cautiously made my way through the floor, my senses on high alert. I kept expecting someone to jump out at me from the shadows, but the floor remained eerily quiet. That is, until I reached the far end of the floor. There, hidden away in a corner, was a small group of people huddled around a cluster of computers. They were all wearing hoodies and masks, their faces hidden from view. I froze, my blood running cold as I realized what I was seeing. These weren't just random people using the network, they were hackers, and they were using the building as their base of operations. I wanted to run, to get as far away from them as I could, but I knew I couldn't. I needed to gather as much information as possible so I could report it to the authorities. I crept closer, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. I listened in on their conversation, trying to piece together what they were planning. It didn't take long to figure it out. They were talking about launching a cyber attack on a major corporation, one that would cripple their systems and leave them vulnerable to attack. I felt a surge of fear coursing through me as I realized the scale of what they were planning. If they succeeded, it could mean chaos for thousands of people, maybe even millions. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew I couldn't take them on by myself. I needed backup, someone who could help me stop them before it was too late. I quietly made my way back to the IT department, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. I called the police and explained the situation, telling them everything I had seen and heard. They arrived quickly, and together we made our way back up to the unused floor. But when we got there, the hackers were gone, leaving behind nothing but empty computers and discarded masks. I felt a sense of relief knowing that they were gone, but I also knew that it wasn't over yet. We still had to track them down and stop them before they could carry out their plan. In the end, we were able to stop the hackers before they could do any real damage. It was a close call, and I'll never forget the fear I felt that night, knowing that the safety of so many people was at stake. But I'm grateful that I was able to do something to help, even if it meant putting myself in danger. And I'll never forget the lesson I learned. Sometimes, the scariest threats aren't the ones you can see, but the ones hiding in the shadows, waiting to strike. I was on a cycling tour through the French countryside, enjoying the peaceful roads and beautiful landscapes. It was my dream trip, and I had been planning it for months. I started early each day, pedaling through small villages and fields of sunflowers. Everything was going perfectly until that one day when everything changed. I was about 20 kilometers from the nearest town when I noticed a group of men in an old van driving slowly behind me. At first, I thought they were just being cautious, but they stayed there, always keeping a distance but never passing. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself they were just locals on a slow drive. After a while, they drove ahead and parked at the side of the road. As I passed, I glanced over and saw them watching me closely. Their stares were intense, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I kept cycling, trying to appear calm, but my mind was racing. I needed to reach the next town quickly. A few kilometers later, I saw the van again, parked at a different spot. This time, one of the men was outside, leaning against the van, smoking a cigarette. He looked at me with a sinister grin as I rode past. My heart started pounding. I had no doubt now that they were following me. I decided to take a detour, hoping to lose them. I turned onto a narrow side road that wound through a dense forest. The road was rough and slowed me down, but I hoped it would be enough to shake them off. For a while, I didn't see them, and I started to feel a glimmer of hope. But then, I heard the sound of an engine behind me. I glanced back and saw the van coming down the road. Panic set in. I pedaled as fast as I could, my legs burning, but the van kept getting closer. The road was too narrow for them to drive fast, which was my only advantage. I saw a small path leading into the forest and decided to take it. I hoped the trees would provide some cover. I jumped off my bike, grabbed it, and ran into the woods. The ground was uneven, making it hard to move quickly, but I kept going, trying to put as much distance between me and the van as possible. After a few minutes, I heard voices behind me. The men were following me on foot. I ducked behind a thick tree, trying to catch my breath without making a sound. The forest was dense, and the light was fading. I hoped the darkness would hide me. I heard them talking in French, their voices getting closer. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid they would hear it. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. They were only a few meters away now, and I could see their flashlights sweeping through the trees. One of them stopped near my hiding spot, shining his light around. I pressed myself against the tree, praying he wouldn't see me. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on, following the others deeper into the forest. I waited until their voices faded before moving again. I needed to get out of there and find help. I knew the nearest town was still several kilometers away, and it was getting dark. I carefully made my way through the forest, trying to stay off the path. Every sound made me jump, but I kept going, driven by fear. Eventually, I found a small clearing and saw a farmhouse in the distance. It was my only hope. I ran towards it, hoping the people inside would help me. When I reached the house, I banged on the door, desperate. An old man opened the door, looking surprised to see me. I quickly explained what was happening, my French broken and frantic. He nodded and ushered me inside, locking the door behind me. His wife brought me some water, and they listened as I told them everything. The old man called the local police, explaining the situation. They told us to stay inside and that they would send someone as soon as possible. The wait was agonizing, every minute feeling like an hour. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see the men any moment. Finally, after what felt like forever, the police arrived. They searched the area and found the van abandoned on the side of the road. There was no sign of the men, but the police assured me they would continue to look for them. They escorted me to the nearest town, where I stayed in a small hotel. I spent the night in a state of constant fear, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short and head back home. The police never found the men, and I never found out why they were following me. But the experience left me shaken. I still love cycling, but now I'm much more cautious about where I go and who I trust. The French countryside is beautiful, but it hides its dangers well. I was lucky to escape, but I'll never forget the terror of that day. Traveling through South America had always been a dream of mine. I had saved up for years and finally took the plunge. I started in Argentina, making my way through Chile, Peru, and then Colombia. Each country had its own charm, and I felt more alive than I had in years. I arrived in Colombia with high spirits. The people were friendly, the food was amazing, and the scenery was breathtaking. I spent a few days in Bogota before heading to Medellin. It was there that I met a group of locals. They seemed nice, always smiling and inviting me to join them for drinks and meals. We quickly became friends. One evening, they suggested a trip to a secluded part of the jungle. They said it was a hidden gem, a place tourists never see. They promised waterfalls, exotic wildlife, and an authentic experience. I was hesitant but also intrigued. I agreed to go. We set out early the next morning. The group consisted of Juan, the leader, along with Carlos, Maria, and a few others. They seemed excited and kept the mood light with jokes and laughter. We took a jeep deep into the jungle, far from any towns or cities. The road was rough, but the scenery was beautiful. After a few hours, we arrived at a small clearing. Juan said we would need to hike the rest of the way. We grabbed our backpacks and set off on foot. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but Juan assured us it was the right way. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. The jungle was dense, and the sounds of wildlife were all around us. We walked for what felt like hours. The sun was starting to set, and I was beginning to worry. I asked Juan how much farther it was, and he just smiled and said we were close. We finally reached a small campsite with a few makeshift huts. Juan said this was where we would spend the night. As we settled in, I noticed that Carlos and Maria were whispering to each other, occasionally glancing in my direction. My unease grew, but I tried to shake it off. We sat around a campfire, and Juan passed around a bottle of local liquor. I took a sip, but my nerves were too frayed to enjoy it. When it got dark, the atmosphere changed. Juan's friendly demeanor vanished. He and the others became quiet, almost tense. I felt trapped. Suddenly, Juan stood up and walked over to me. He looked down with a cold, hard stare. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and threatening. Before I could react, Carlos and another man grabbed me, forcing me to my feet. They dragged me to one of the huts and threw me inside. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. They locked the door from the outside, leaving me in darkness. Panic set in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one responded. I tried to think of a way out. The walls of the hut were thin, made of wooden planks. I started to kick at them, hoping to break through. After several tries, one of the planks gave way, creating a small hole. I squeezed through, scratching my arms and tearing my shirt. Once outside, I saw that the campfire was still burning, but the group was nowhere in sight. I needed to get away fast. I remembered the trail we took and decided to follow it back. I ran through the jungle, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds of the night were deafening. I stumbled over roots and rocks, cutting my hands and knees. I heard voices behind me, shouting in Spanish. They were coming after me. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain and fear. I had to find the jeep and get out of there. The jungle seemed endless, but I kept going. Finally, I saw the clearing ahead. The jeep was still there, parked where we left it. I reached the jeep and yanked the door open. The keys were still in the ignition. I jumped in and started the engine, praying it would start. The jeep roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, I saw one and the others burst from the trees, shouting and waving their arms. They were too late. I drove as fast as I could, not daring to slow down until I was far away. When I finally reached a town, I went straight to the police. They took my statement and sent officers to the jungle, but I never found out what happened to one and his group. I left Colombia the next day, shaken but relieved to be alive. The experience haunts me to this day. I had trusted those people, thinking they were friends. It was a harsh lesson about trust and the dangers that can lurk behind friendly faces. I had my old camper van, which had served me well on many trips before. I loved the solitude and beauty of the desert, away from the noise of the city. One evening, I found a quiet spot off a dirt road to park for the night. It was miles away from any town, perfect for some peace and quiet. The sunset was breathtaking. I made a simple dinner, sat outside the van, and enjoyed the silence. After a while, I got inside, locked the doors, and settled in for the night. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, full of stars. I felt safe and content. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a soft hissing noise, followed by a thud. I listened carefully but couldn't hear anything else. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal or the wind. But then I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I peered out the small window but couldn't see much in the darkness. My heart was pounding. I decided to stay quiet and hope whoever it was would leave. The footsteps moved around the van, and I heard a scraping sound near the tires. Then, silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Slowly, I got up and looked out the window again. This time, I saw a figure standing a few yards away, just watching the van. The moonlight cast a shadow, but I couldn't make out any details. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to stay calm and think clearly. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. I felt trapped and helpless. The figure didn't move. I wondered if it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I decided to turn on the headlights to get a better look. My hand shook as I reached for the switch. When the lights came on, the figure was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. I heard the sound of something metallic hitting the ground near the back of the van. I turned off the lights and listened again. There were more footsteps, moving away this time. I needed to see what was happening. I took a flashlight and cautiously opened the side door. The air was still, and the desert was eerily quiet. I shone the light around the van and saw the damage. All 4 tires were slashed. I was stranded. Fear gripped me, but I knew I had to stay alert. I looked around but didn't see anyone. Then, in the distance, I noticed a faint light moving away. It was the figure, heading toward the hills. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't drive, and there was no cell signal. My only option was to stay put and hope for daylight. I got back inside the van, locked the doors, and tried to stay calm. Sleep was impossible. Every little noise made me jump. I kept thinking about the figure and what they might do next. As the hours dragged on, I heard a vehicle approaching. My heart raced, unsure if it was help or more trouble. A truck pulled up beside the van, and a man got out. He looked rough, with a grizzled beard and worn clothes. He shone a flashlight into my van, and I felt exposed. "Hey! You all right in there?" he called out. I hesitated but finally opened the door slightly. "My tires got slashed," I said, my voice trembling. "Someone was out here watching me." The man nodded. "Yeah, we've had some trouble with vandals around here. Let's see what we can do." He seemed sincere, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He walked around the van, checking the tires. "You're gonna need new ones," he said. "I've got a spare back at my place, but it's a few miles away. You want to come with me, or wait here?" The thought of staying alone in the van was terrifying. "I'll come with you," I said, grabbing my backpack and flashlight. We drove in silence, the man keeping an eye on the road. I watched the desert landscape, feeling vulnerable. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small, rundown cabin. He parked the truck in motion for me to follow. Inside, the cabin was cluttered but seemed safe. "Wait here," he said, heading to the back. I looked around, noticing old tools and camping gear. The place felt lived in, but not welcoming. He returned with a tire and some tools. "Let's get you fixed up," he said, and we headed back to the van. The drive felt quicker this time, and I was relieved to see my van still there, untouched. We worked in silence, changing the tires. The man was efficient, and soon enough, the van was ready to go. "You should head to the nearest town and report this," he said. "It's about 20 miles west." I thanked him, still wary but grateful. He nodded and drove off, leaving me alone again. I got in the van and started driving, the fear slowly fading as the sun began to rise. By the time I reached the town, I felt a sense of relief. I found a gas station and called the local authorities, reporting what had happened. They took my statement but didn't seem optimistic about catching the person responsible. I decided to cut my trip short and head back home. The experience had shaken me deeply. The desert, once a place of beauty and solitude, now felt hostile and dangerous. Back home, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure and what might have happened if the man hadn't shown up. It took weeks for me to feel safe again. I learned to be more cautious and aware of my surroundings, and I vowed never to camp alone in such remote areas again. The desert's beauty was overshadowed by the terror I experienced, a nightmare that would stay with me forever. We thought we found the perfect spot for a weekend of stealth camping in the dense forests of Pennsylvania. My friend and I, we were eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, even if just for a couple of days. But little did we know, our weekend getaway would turn into a nightmare. As the sun began to set, we settled into our makeshift campsite, nestled amongst the towering trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. But as darkness fell, a sense of unease settled over us. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something wasn't quite right about our secluded spot in the forest. Suddenly, we heard the crack of a twig snapping somewhere nearby. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests as we strained to listen for any sign of movement in the darkness. That's when we saw him, a shadowy figure emerging from the trees, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. He was tall and gaunt, with a wild look in his eyes that sent shivers down our spines. Without a word, he lunged towards us, his movements erratic and unpredictable. We scrambled to our feet and took off running, crashing through the underbrush as we tried to put as much distance between us and our pursuer as possible. But no matter how fast we ran, he was always right behind us, his heavy footsteps echoing through the forest as he closed in on us with terrifying speed. We ducked and dodged through the trees, our hearts pounding in our chests as we desperately tried to lose him in the darkness. But he was relentless, his presence looming over us like a shadow in the night. Just when we thought we couldn't run any longer, we stumbled upon a clearing in the forest. Without hesitation, we dashed towards the safety of the open space, hoping against hope that we could find some way to escape our pursuer. But as we reached the edge of the clearing, we came face to face with a steep drop-off, a sheer cliff that plummeted down into the darkness below. We skidded to a halt at the edge, our hearts sinking as we realized we had nowhere left to run. With our backs against the cliff, we turned to face our attacker, our minds racing as we tried to come up with a plan. But he was already upon us, his eyes burning with a manic intensity as he lunged towards us with outstretched hands. In a desperate bid for survival, we fought back with everything we had, throwing punches and kicks with reckless abandon as we tried to fend him off. But he was too strong, overpowering us with ease as he pinned us to the ground with a vice-like grip. We struggled and thrashed, but it was no use, he had us trapped, at his mercy in the heart of the forest. And as he loomed over us, his face contorted with rage, we braced ourselves for the worst. But just as it seemed all hope was lost, we heard the sound of approaching footsteps. We looked up to see a group of hikers emerging from the trees, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they hurried towards us. With a final burst of energy, we managed to break free from our attacker's grasp and scramble to our feet. The hikers wasted no time in coming to our aid, surrounding us and driving our attacker back with shouts and warnings. Together, we fled into the safety of the night, putting as much distance between us and our would-be assailant as possible. And as we emerged from the forest, shaken but alive, we knew that we had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. I parked my van in a remote spot in the backwoods of Louisiana, hoping for a quiet night. The area was thick with trees and underbrush, and the nearest town was miles away. I was on a break from work, looking to enjoy some solitude. The forest was dense and silent, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the stillness. After setting up camp, I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove and settled in for the evening. The air was cool, and the sky was clear. As darkness fell, I locked the doors of my van, feeling secure in my isolation. I read for a while, the silence of the forest wrapping around me like a blanket. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard the sound. It was a distant, muffled noise, like something heavy moving through the trees. I dismissed it as an animal, but my nerves were on edge. I continued reading, but the noise grew louder, closer. I turned off my light and listened, my heart pounding. Voices, low and rough, tarried on the wind. They were getting nearer. I peered out the small window, straining to see through the darkness. Figures moved in the shadows, carrying rifles. My blood ran cold. Poachers, I thought, hoping they wouldn't notice me. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the trees and landing on my van. Panic surged through me. I ducked down, hoping they hadn't seen me. The voices grew louder, and I could make out words now. Over here. Looks like a camp. My breath caught in my throat. I heard footsteps approaching, crunching on the gravel. I had to do something. Grabbing my keys, I considered driving away, but the fear of making noise and drawing attention stopped me. Check it out. Maybe it's a game warden, one of the men said, his voice closer now. I realized with horror they thought I was there to bust them. The door handle rattled, and I held my breath. Locked, One of them grunted. "We need to find out who's inside." I had to act fast. I quietly climbed into the driver's seat, keys in hand, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, backing away from the men. Shouts erupted as they realized I was escaping. Gunshots rang out, and a bullet shattered the rear window. I floored the gas, heart pounding, as I sped down the dirt road. The van bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, but I didn't dare slow down. In the rearview mirror, I saw headlights. They were following me. I took a sharp turn, hoping to lose them in the maze of back roads. The van skidded, tires struggling for grip, but I managed to stay on the road. The headlights were still there, getting closer. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus. I remembered a narrow trail I had passed earlier, barely wide enough for the van. I swerved onto it, branches scraping the sides, and the headlights behind me swerved too. They were relentless. The trail twisted and turned, and I fought to keep control. Suddenly, the trees opened up, and I found myself on the edge of a steep hill. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. The truck behind me wasn't as lucky. It barreled out of the trees and crashed into the side of my van, sending us both over the edge. The world spun as we tumbled down the hill. The van rolled, glass shattering and metal crunching. I was thrown around, every impact sending pain through my body. Finally, we came to a stop at the bottom. The silence was deafening. Dazed, I crawled out of the wreckage. My body ached, but I could move. I had to get away before they found me. I stumbled through the trees, trying to put as much distance between myself and the crash as possible. Voices echoed in the distance, angry and frantic. They were searching for me. I kept moving, ignoring the pain and exhaustion. The forest was a maze, but I hoped to find a road or some sign of civilization. Hours passed. The night seemed endless, and I was losing hope. Then, in the faint light of dawn, I saw a cabin. It looked abandoned, but it was shelter. I forced myself to the door and found it unlocked. Inside, it was dark and musty, but safe. I collapsed on the floor, too exhausted to move. I listened for any sounds of pursuit, but heard nothing. I had made it. I was safe, for now. When the sun rose, I ventured out, cautious and wary. I needed to find help. After hours of walking, I stumbled upon a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver took one look at me and called the police. It took a while to explain what happened, but they eventually believed me. The poachers were caught, their operation shut down. I was treated for my injuries and given a ride back to town. The experience left me shaken and wary of the wilderness. I still love the solitude and beauty of nature, but I'm more cautious now. My name is Molly, and I thought you saw that I'm going to take a trip to Greece alone. My life was getting boring and I had some money saved, plus it was something I had always wanted to do, and I finally had the chance. The first few days were perfect. I explored Athens, visited the Acropolis, and enjoyed the local food. It was everything I hoped for and more. One morning, I woke up in my small hotel room, ready for another day of adventure. But when I looked around, I noticed something was off. My bag, which I had left on the chair, was gone. I checked the room thoroughly, thinking maybe I had misplaced it, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. My passport, wallet, phone, everything was in that bag. I had no way to prove who I was or contact anyone for help. I went to the hotel reception, trying to stay calm. The receptionist looked concerned and called the local police for me. The police arrived and took my statement. They seemed sympathetic but not very hopeful. They told me that thefts like this were common in tourist areas. They advised me to go to the embassy to get a temporary passport. I thanked them and tried to stay positive, even though I felt completely lost. I walked to the American embassy, my heart racing. When I got there, I explained my situation to the staff. They asked for some details and filled out some forms. They said it would take a few days to process everything. I nodded, trying to hold back my frustration and fear. Without any money or identification, I had to rely on the embassy's resources. They gave me some cash and helped me find a new place to stay. It was a small hostel, not far from the embassy. I felt grateful but also vulnerable. Over the next few days, I stayed mostly in the hostel, too scared to venture far. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every noise made me jump, every shadow seemed threatening. I kept checking in with the embassy, hoping for some good news. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard footsteps outside my room. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I slowly got up and crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. The next day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I needed to get out of the hostel, even just for a little while. As I walked through the streets, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one seemed suspicious. I turned into a small cafe, hoping to find some comfort in a cup of coffee. As I sat there, I noticed a man at a nearby table, staring at me. He looked away when I met his gaze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I quickly finished my coffee and left. On my way back to the hostel, I felt the same unease. I walked faster, constantly looking around. When I got back, I locked the door and tried to calm down. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The next morning, I went to the embassy again. They told me my temporary passport was ready. Relief washed over me. I could finally go home. They arranged for a taxi to take me to the airport. As I packed my things, I couldn't wait to leave Greece and this nightmare behind. At the airport, I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid that someone might try to stop me. But everything went smoothly. I boarded the plane, took my seat, and let out a sigh of relief as the plane took off. I was finally going home. The whole experience left me shaken. I loved Greece, but the fear and anxiety I felt overshadowed everything else. I had been planning my summer hike in Yosemite for months. I needed a break from the city and thought a solo adventure would be the perfect escape. I started early in the morning. The sun was barely up, and the air was still cool. The park was beautiful, everything I had hoped for. I took my time, snapping pictures and enjoying the tranquility. It was a perfect day. Around midday, I was taking a break near a small stream when I heard voices approaching. 3 people emerged from the trail, a man and 2 women. They looked friendly enough, all smiles and relaxed postures. We chatted for a bit. They said they were also hiking and had been coming to Yosemite for years. They seemed to know the area well, and I felt comfortable with them. They invited me to join them, saying they knew a great spot not too far off the main trail where we could get an incredible view of the valley. I hesitated for a moment but decided to go along. I figured it would be nice to have some company for a while. We walked and talked, and they seemed genuinely nice. As we moved further off the main path, the trail became less defined. The man, who introduced himself as David, led the way. He pointed out various landmarks and shared stories about past hikes. The women, Sarah and Emily, walked behind me, keeping up a friendly chatter. I didn't think much of it at the time. After about an hour of walking, the trail completely disappeared. I started feeling uneasy and asked if we were close to the spot they mentioned. David assured me it was just a bit further, but the tone of his voice had changed slightly. It wasn't the same friendly tone from before. I shrugged it off, trying to stay positive. We finally arrived at a clearing. The view was breathtaking, but my discomfort grew. The spot was isolated, far from any marked trails. David suggested we take a break, so we all sat down. They offered me some water and snacks, which I politely declined, sticking to my own supplies. As we rested, their behavior started to change. They became more silent, exchanging glances that made me feel like an outsider. I decided it was time to head back and mentioned I wanted to return to the main trail. David didn't argue but suggested a different route back, saying it would be faster. I agreed, not wanting to cause any trouble. We started walking again, but this new path felt wrong. It was steep and rugged, clearly not a frequently used trail. I asked if they were sure about the direction, and David snapped, saying he knew where he was going. His sudden anger caught me off guard, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized then how isolated we were. No one would hear me if I screamed. My heart pounded as I weighed my options. I decided to play along for the moment, hoping to find a chance to slip away. Sarah and Emily were walking closer to me now, too close for comfort. Their friendly facade was gone. After another half hour, I saw a chance. We reached a narrow section of the path with dense trees on either side. I pretended to tie my shoe, slowing down enough to let them get a bit ahead. Then, without warning, I bolted into the trees, running as fast as I could. I heard them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. The terrain was rough, branches scratching my arms and face. I kept running, adrenaline pushing me forward. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto a familiar trail. Relief washed over me, but I didn't stop. I kept going until I reached a group of hikers. Breathless and terrified, I explained what had happened. They stayed with me, guiding me back to the main area of the park where I reported the incident to the rangers. I gave a detailed description of the trio, but I never saw them again. The rangers assured me they would investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere in the park. I cut my trip short and returned home, shaken but safe. The experience haunted me for weeks. I had always been careful, never expecting such danger in a place I loved. I learned to trust my instincts and never let my guard down, no matter how friendly strangers might seem. That hike changed me. Yosemite, a place of beauty and peace, now held a darker memory. I still love hiking, but I'm more cautious now. I was on a business trip to Russia, staying in Moscow for a week to finalize a deal with a local company. The trip started off well. I met my contacts, attended meetings, and even had some time to explore the city. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. On the fourth day, I had a meeting scheduled with one of the company's executives at a high-end restaurant. We discussed the final details of the deal over dinner. The food was great, and the conversation was friendly. After we finished, I thanked him and headed back to my hotel. The next morning, I woke up to loud knocking on my hotel room door. I opened it to find two police officers standing there. They were speaking in rapid Russian, and I struggled to understand. One of them handed me a piece of paper. It was an arrest warrant. My heart started racing. They were accusing me of theft, saying I had stolen valuable documents from the company. I tried to explain that there must be some mistake, that I hadn't taken anything, but they didn't seem to care. They handcuffed me and took me to the police station. I felt a mix of fear and confusion. How could this be happening? At the station, they put me in a small, cold cell. I kept trying to tell them I was innocent, but no one listened. I was allowed one phone call, so I called my company back in the States. They were shocked and promised to contact the American embassy. Hours passed before I was taken to an interrogation room. A stern-looking officer sat across from me, asking questions through a translator. He wanted to know where I had hidden the documents. I insisted I didn't know anything about them, but he kept pressing. The atmosphere was tense, and I could feel the weight of the situation crushing me. I was thrown back into the cell, my mind racing. I thought about the dinner, the conversations, trying to remember anything that might help. Then it hit me, the executive. He had seemed too friendly, almost eager to finalize the deal. Was it possible he had set me up? The next day, a lawyer from the embassy came to see me. He was sympathetic but didn't seem hopeful. He explained that the legal system here was difficult to navigate, especially for foreigners. Corruption was rampant, and proving my innocence would be an uphill battle. Days turned into weeks. I was moved to a larger prison, sharing a cell with other inmates. Some were kind, others not so much. The food was terrible, and the conditions were harsh. I kept thinking about my family back home, wondering if I would ever see them again. The lawyer worked tirelessly, digging into the case. He managed to find out that the documents had indeed been stolen, but there was no solid evidence linking me to the crime. It was all based on the executive's testimony. I felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the reality of my situation. One night, I was woken up by a guard. He told me I had a visitor. It was the lawyer again, looking more serious than ever. He said they had found something, a security camera footage from the restaurant. It showed the executive slipping something into my bag while I wasn't looking. This was the break we needed. The lawyer presented the footage in court, along with other evidence showing my innocence. It was a slow process, but the judge finally agreed to review the case. The executive was called in for questioning, and his story started to fall apart under scrutiny. After what felt like an eternity, I was finally released. The charges were dropped, and I was free to go. I couldn't believe it. The nightmare was over, but I felt exhausted and broken. I thanked the lawyer and everyone who had helped me, and I made my way to the airport. On the flight back home, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. It was a terrifying experience, one that I wouldn't wish on anyone. I decided to go stealth camping alone in a camper van in a remote part of Utah. The vast, open landscapes appealed to me, and I wanted some time away from the noise of the city. I found a quiet spot off a dirt road, surrounded by desert and rocky hills. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and red, and I felt a sense of peace. That night, I cooked a simple meal and sat by the van, enjoying the silence. The stars were starting to appear, and it was mesmerizing. After a while, I climbed into the van, locked the doors, and settled into my sleeping bag. The quiet of the desert was comforting, and I drifted off to sleep easily. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I couldn't figure out what had disturbed my sleep. The van was dark, and everything outside was silent. I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. Then I heard a faint rustling sound coming from outside the van. My pulse quickened. I strained to hear, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But the sound grew louder, and I could hear voices, low and urgent, speaking in hushed tones. Panic started to set in. I moved as quietly as I could, peeking through a small gap in the window curtains. In the dim moonlight, I saw a group of men, 4 or 5, creeping around the van. They were armed, carrying rifles and handguns. My blood ran cold. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but it couldn't be good. One of them was trying to pry open the back door with a crowbar. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't get in. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. I had no weapon, no phone signal, and no one knew where I was. I felt utterly trapped. I heard one of the men say something about a witness. They thought I had seen something I shouldn't have. I realized then that they were here to silence me. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I had to act fast. I quietly moved to the front of the van and checked the driver's seat. The keys were there. I prayed the engine would start quietly, but I knew it wouldn't. I took a deep breath, readying myself for what was to come. With a quick twist of the key, the engine roared to life. The men shouted in surprise, and I saw them scramble towards the front of the van. I floored the gas pedal, the van lurching forward. A gunshot rang out, and I ducked instinctively, feeling the van swerve. The bullet shattered a side window, but I kept driving. The dirt road was rough, and the van bounced and jolted violently. I saw the men's truck in my rearview mirror, their headlights growing brighter as they gave chase. Fear gripped me, but I knew I had to stay focused. I couldn't let them catch me. I drove as fast as I could, the van's tires kicking up clouds of dust. The road twisted and turned, and I struggled to keep control. More gunshots rang out, and I felt a bullet hit the back of the van. I had to find a way to lose them. Up ahead, I saw a narrow trail veering off the main road. It was risky, but I had no choice. I turned sharply onto the trail, the van barely squeezing through the tight path. The headlights behind me grew dimmer as the terrain became more rugged. The trail led into a narrow canyon, and I knew it was my chance. I turned off the van's lights and slowed down, hoping the darkness would hide me. I could hear their truck still searching, but the sound was getting fainter. I kept driving, deeper into the canyon. Finally, I reached a spot where the trail widened slightly. I pulled the van behind a large rock formation and turned off the engine. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I listened intently, straining to hear any sign of the men. For what felt like hours, I stayed there, hidden in the darkness. I didn't hear their truck anymore. I hoped they had given up or taken a different path. I couldn't stay there forever, but I needed to be sure they were gone. As dawn began to break, I cautiously started the van again. The engine noise seemed deafening in the stillness. I drove slowly, carefully making my way back to the main road. Every sound, every shadow made me jump, but I didn't see the men or their truck. Eventually, I reached a small town. I pulled into a gas station, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. I told the attendant what had happened, and they called the local authorities. I knew I was safe, but the fear and adrenaline still coursed through me. The police took my statement and promised to look into it. I didn't have much hope they would find the men, but at least I was alive. My friend Sarah and I decided to take a break from the city and go camping in the Appalachian Mountains. We had an old camper van and thought it would be perfect for some stealth camping in a remote part of the mountains. We wanted peace and quiet, away from everything. We arrived in the late afternoon and found a secluded spot off a dirt road. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by trees and far from any other people. We set up a small campfire, cooked some dinner, and settled in for the night. The sky was clear, and the stars were shining brightly. After dinner, we decided to take a short walk around the area before going to bed. The forest was quiet, and we enjoyed the sounds of nature. As we walked back to the van, we noticed a truck parked on the dirt road, not far from where we were camping. It seemed out of place, but we didn't think much of it. Back at the van, we locked the doors and got ready for bed. We were both tired from the day's drive and hike. Just as we were about to fall asleep, we heard footsteps outside the van. At first, we thought it might be an animal, but then we heard voices. "Hey! Who's in there?" a man shouted, banging on the side of the van. We froze, unsure of what to do. "Go away!" Sarah shouted back, trying to sound brave. But the banging continued, louder this time. "Open up," another voice demanded. "This is private property. You need to leave." I peeked out the window and saw 3 men standing outside. They looked rough and angry. One of them had a baseball bat, and another was holding a flashlight, shining it into the van. "We're not causing any trouble," I said, trying to reason with them. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." "Not good enough," the first man said. "Get out now, or we'll make you." Fear gripped us both. We didn't want to confront them, but we didn't have much choice. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, then slowly opened the door, stepping out into the cold night. The men surrounded us, their expressions hostile. "What are you doing here?" the man with the bat asked, his tone threatening. "We're just camping," Sarah said. "We didn't know this was private property." "Well, now you know," he sneered. "And we don't want you here." "Look, we'll pack up and leave right now," I said, trying to stay calm. "Too late for that," another man said. "You should have left when we first told you." One of the men grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her towards the truck. "Hey! Let her go!" I shouted, stepping forward. The man with the bat raised it, and I froze. "You're not going anywhere until we say so," he said, his eyes cold. They forced us into the back of the truck and drove off, deeper into the mountains. We had no idea where they were taking us, and the fear was overwhelming. The truck finally stopped, and they dragged us out, throwing us to the ground. "Maybe this will teach you to stay away," one of them said, kicking dirt at us. They left us there, alone and scared, and drove off. We were miles from our van, in the middle of nowhere. Sarah was shaking, and I felt sick with fear. We had no choice but to start walking, hoping to find our way back. The forest was dark, and every sound made us jump. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the faint glow of our campfire in the distance. We hurried towards it, desperate to get back to the safety of the van. When we arrived, we quickly packed up our things, not wanting to risk another encounter with those men. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached a small town. We found a motel and checked in, both of us too shaken to sleep. The reality of what had happened started to sink in, and we couldn't stop trembling. The next morning, we reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too interested. They took our statement but said there wasn't much they could do without more information about the men. We decided to cut our trip short and head back home. The experience had left us both traumatized, and we couldn't shake the fear that something like that could happen again. The mountains, once a place of beauty and peace, now felt dangerous and hostile. Back home, we couldn't stop thinking about the men and what might have happened if we hadn't managed to escape. It took weeks for us to feel safe again, and we vowed never to go camping in such remote areas without better protection. The trip had changed us both. We learned to be more cautious, more aware of our surroundings, and never to take our safety for granted. I was on a cruise in the Caribbean, hoping to unwind and enjoy some time away from work. The ship was massive, almost like a floating city, with everything you could imagine on board. My cabin was on one of the lower decks, but it was cozy and had a small porthole that looked out onto the endless sea. One evening, after dinner, I decided to take a walk around the ship. It was quiet. Most passengers were at the theater or in the various lounges. I wandered through the corridors, enjoying the peace. The ship felt almost deserted in some areas, which I liked. It gave me time to think. As I walked past one of the smaller lounges, I heard raised voices. Curious, I slowed down and peeked through the small window on the door. Inside, I saw two men arguing. One of them was tall and had a menacing look, the other looked scared. They were speaking in hushed tones, but their body language told me something was very wrong. Suddenly, the taller man grabbed the other by the throat and slammed him against the wall. I froze, my heart pounding. I watched in horror as the tall man pulled out a knife and plunged it into the other man's chest. The victim's eyes went wide with terror before he crumpled to the floor. I stumbled back, a gasp escaping my lips. The killer's head snapped towards the door. I saw his eyes lock onto mine through the window. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I could hear the door to the lounge burst open behind me. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted through the maze of hallways, trying to remember the layout of the ship. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might explode. I needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere he wouldn't find me. I turned a corner and saw a maintenance closet. Without thinking, I dove inside and closed the door as quietly as I could. I crouched in the dark, trying to control my breathing. I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. He was searching for me. I covered my mouth with my hand, tears streaming down my face. The footsteps stopped right outside the closet. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't open the door. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. Finally, I heard him move away. I waited a bit longer, just to be sure, then cautiously opened the door and peeked out. The corridor was empty. I slipped out and headed in the opposite direction, my mind racing. I needed to find security or the captain, someone who could help. I made my way to the upper decks, sticking to the shadows. The ship was still eerily quiet. I passed a few passengers, but they were absorbed in their own conversations, oblivious to my terror. I finally reached the security office, only to find it empty. Panic set in again. Where was everyone? I decided to head to the bridge. Surely the captain would be there. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, every sound making me jump. When I reached the bridge, I found the door slightly ajar. I slipped inside, but to my horror, it was empty too. Desperation clawed at me. I was alone. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see the killer standing in the doorway, his knife glinting in the dim light. "Thought you could hide from me?" he sneered. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. My back hit the control panel, and I felt a cold sweat break out. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You don't have to do this." He just smiled, a cold, merciless smile. "But I do," he said, taking a step closer. I looked around frantically, my eyes landing on the ship's intercom. Without thinking, I grabbed the microphone and screamed, "Help! Murderer on the bridge!" The killer lunged at me, but I ducked just in time. He swung the knife, but it missed me by inches. I grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and swung it at him with all my strength. It connected with his head, and he stumbled back, dazed. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I bolted out of the bridge and down the nearest stairwell. I could hear shouts and footsteps above me, My call for help had been heard. Relief flooded through me as I ran towards the main deck. Security officers were rushing towards the bridge. I flagged them down, breathless and trembling. "He's up there," I managed to say. "He's got a knife." They nodded and continued up the stairs, weapons drawn. I sank to the floor, my whole body shaking. Passengers gathered around, asking what happened, but I couldn't speak. The reality of what I'd witnessed and narrowly escaped from was too much to process. Minutes later, I heard a commotion as the officers subdued the killer. They led him away in handcuffs, his face bruised and bleeding. He glared at me as they passed, but I knew he couldn't hurt me now. The passengers and crew members who had gathered around cheered as he was taken away. One of the officers helped me to my feet and took me to the medical bay. A doctor checked me over, and another officer took my statement. I recounted everything I had seen and experienced, my voice shaking but determined. I wanted to make sure they understood the danger this man posed. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a wave. The ship's crew arranged for me to stay in a different cabin, away from where the attack had happened. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my mind replaying the events over and over. By morning, the ship's captain came to see me. He apologized profusely for what had happened and assured me that the killer was locked up and would be handed over to the authorities as soon as we docked. He also praised my bravery, but I didn't feel brave. I just felt lucky to be alive. The rest of the cruise was a blur. The other passengers were kind, but I kept to myself, needing time to process what had happened. When we finally docked, I was more than ready to leave the ship behind. The memory of that night would stay with me forever, but I was determined not to let it define me. As I stepped off the ship, I took a deep breath of the salty sea air and felt a sense of relief. I was free, and I was alive. That was all that mattered. I had always wanted to hike the Swiss Alps. It was a dream of mine. So, when I finally saved enough money, I took a solo trip. I had read so much about the trails and the stunning views. I couldn't wait to experience it all firsthand. The first few days were everything I hoped for. The air was fresh, the scenery was breathtaking, and I felt free. On the fourth day, I decided to take a less traveled path. I thought it would be nice to avoid the usual tourist spots. The trail was steep and rocky, but I was prepared. At least, I thought I was. About halfway through the day, I slipped on a wet rock and twisted my ankle badly. The pain shot through my leg, and I couldn't put any weight on it. I was alone, miles away from the nearest village, with no cell signal. I tried to keep calm. I knew I had to find help or shelter for the night. Hobbling along, using a stick for support, I stumbled upon a small cabin. Relief washed over me. I knocked on the door, hoping someone would be inside. After a moment, a man opened the door. He was in his mid-40s, with a rugged look and piercing eyes. He seemed concerned when he saw me. I told him about my ankle, and he invited me in. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fire burning in the fireplace. He introduced himself as Hans and said he lived there alone. He offered to take a look at my ankle. I hesitated but eventually agreed, the pain too intense to refuse help. Hans examined my ankle and said it was badly sprained. He wrapped it in a bandage and gave me some painkillers. I was grateful and felt a bit more at ease. He said I could stay the night and he'd help me get to a doctor in the morning. Exhausted and in pain, I accepted his offer. That night, I slept in a small room at the back of the cabin. I woke up several times, my ankle throbbing, but also feeling a strange unease. Something about Hans didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was his intense gaze or the way he watched me a little too closely. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my paranoia from being in a strange place. In the morning, Hans brought me breakfast and asked how I was feeling. I thanked him and said I was ready to leave as soon as possible. But he seemed to avoid the subject, talking instead about the weather and the mountains. My unease grew, but I was stuck. I couldn't walk far on my own, and I had no way to call for help. As the day went on, Hans's demeanor changed. He became more controlling, not letting me out of his sight. I asked again about getting to a doctor, and he got angry, saying it wasn't safe to travel yet. Panic started to set in. I realized I was trapped in the cabin with a man I knew nothing about, and I had no way to escape. The next night, I pretended to sleep, hoping to find a chance to sneak out. But Hans never went to bed. He stayed up, watching me from the living room. I could see the outline of his figure against the dim light of the fire. Every time I moved, his head turned towards me. I felt a cold fear creeping over me. In the morning, I decided to confront him. I told him I needed to leave, that I couldn't stay any longer. His response was chilling. He said I wasn't going anywhere until he decided it was safe. His eyes had a wild look, and I knew I had to find a way out, fast. I waited until he went to the outhouse behind the cabin. I limped to the door, my heart pounding, and tried to open it quietly. It was locked. Hans must have locked it from the outside. Desperation set in. I looked around for anything I could use to defend myself or break a window, but there was nothing. When Hans came back, he saw me near the door and smiled, a knowing smile that sent chills down my spine. He didn't say anything, just sat by the fire and watched me. The days blurred together after that. He kept me in the room, bringing me food and water but never letting me out of his sight. My ankle slowly healed, but the psychological terror was worse than the physical pain. I knew I had to make a move. One night, when Hans fell asleep in his chair by the fire, I found a small, rusty knife in the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was my only chance. I waited, barely breathing, until I was sure he was deeply asleep. Then, I crept towards the door and managed to pick the lock with the knife. It took what felt like forever, every tiny noise making me jump. Finally, the lock clicked open. I slipped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I hobbled as fast as I could down the trail, not daring to look back. I heard a shout from the cabin and knew Hans had woken up. Panic gave me strength, and I pushed through the pain, moving faster than I thought possible. I reached a small village at dawn. The locals were shocked to see me, disheveled and in tears. They helped me to the nearest clinic, and I told them everything. The authorities were called, and they went to the cabin, but Hans was gone. They found evidence of other victims, though, people who had never been reported missing because they were travelers like me, far from home. I made it back home, but the experience left deep scars. The fear, the helplessness, it all stayed with me. I decided to go backpacking in the Swiss Alps. It was something I had always wanted to do, and I finally had the time and savings to make it happen. The scenery was incredible, and the weather was perfect. I spent the first few days hiking through valleys and over mountain passes, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the landscape. On the fourth day, I met another solo hiker. His name was Lucas, or at least that's what he told me. He was around my age, mid-30s, with short brown hair and a friendly demeanor. We started talking and ended up hiking together for most of the day. He seemed knowledgeable about the area and even gave me some tips on where to camp and which trails to take. We set up camp near a small lake that evening. Lucas seemed relaxed, and we shared stories about our travels and lives back home. He said he was from Germany and was taking some time off to explore the Alps. He had a charming way about him, and I felt at ease in his company. The next day, we continued hiking together. But as the day went on, I started to notice little things that didn't quite add up. He seemed to know too much about avoiding main trails and finding secluded spots. His gear was top-notch, almost like he was prepared for more than just a casual hike. That night, as we sat by the campfire, Lucas became more serious. He asked me if I had told anyone where I was going or when I planned to return. It seemed like an odd question, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I told him I had given my itinerary to a friend back home. The next morning, I woke up to find Lucas already awake and packing his things. He looked tense, and his friendly demeanor was gone. He told me he needed to move quickly and that it was best if we split up. I was confused but agreed, thinking maybe he just wanted to hike alone again. As I packed my own gear, I noticed my wallet was missing. Panic set in. I confronted Lucas, but he denied taking it. I didn't believe him, but I was alone in the mountains with no way to prove it. I decided to leave and head back to a more populated area as quickly as possible. I hiked for hours, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. But around midday, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Lucas approaching. He had a desperate look in his eyes. He admitted he had taken my wallet and begged me to help him. He said he was in trouble and needed a new identity to escape. He was a fugitive, wanted for something he wouldn't specify. I was terrified. Here was this man, someone I had thought of as a friend, revealing he was on the run and willing to do anything to stay free. He pleaded with me to switch identities, to take his documents and give him mine. I refused, knowing it was a bad idea, but he became agitated. He grabbed my arm and tried to take my backpack. I struggled, but he was stronger. I managed to break free and ran down the trail, my heart pounding. I could hear him chasing me, yelling at me to stop. I didn't look back, just kept running as fast as I could. Eventually, I came to a small village. I ran to the nearest building, which turned out to be a small inn, and begged the owner to call the police. The owner saw the fear in my eyes and immediately called. Lucas arrived a few minutes later, but the innkeeper stood between us, telling him to leave. Lucas hesitated, then turned and walked away. The police arrived soon after. I told them everything. They took my statement and searched the area but couldn't find Lucas. They assured me they would continue looking, but I knew he was long gone. They helped me get a replacement ID and enough money to get back home. I finished my trip early and returned home, shaken but safe. The experience left me wary of strangers, and I still get anxious when I think about it. The Swiss Alps were supposed to be a peaceful escape, but instead, they became the backdrop to the most terrifying experience of my life. I'm just grateful I managed to get out of there alive. I went to a remote island to study marine biology. It was a great opportunity. My mentor, Dr. Carlson, was known for his work with marine life, and I was excited to learn from him. The island was far from the mainland, with only a small research station and a few cabins. The first few weeks were amazing. We saw dolphins, sharks, and all kinds of fish. Dr. Carlson was intense but seemed dedicated to his work. He often went off alone for hours, saying he needed to collect samples. I didn't think much of it at first. One day, I noticed something strange. Dr. Carlson had a locked room in the research station. When I asked about it, he got defensive and told me it was just storage. His reaction made me curious, but I didn't push it. I figured he had his reasons. Late one night, I couldn't sleep and decided to go for a walk. As I passed the research station, I heard noises coming from the locked room. It sounded like machinery and something else, like muffled cries. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The next day, Dr. Carlson was more secretive than usual. He kept checking the locked room and didn't seem to notice I was watching. When he left for one of his solo trips, I decided to take a look. I found a set of keys in his office and managed to unlock the door. What I saw inside was horrifying. There were tanks with creatures I didn't recognize, and some of them looked like they were in pain. There were also surgical tools and blood stains. I realized Dr. Carlson wasn't just studying marine life, he was experimenting on it, and the experiments were cruel. I quickly locked the door and put the keys back before he returned. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't confront him. He was much stronger and had control over everything on the island. I decided to gather evidence and report him when we returned to the mainland. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. I heard footsteps outside my cabin and peeked out the window. Dr. Carlson was standing there, staring at my door. My blood ran cold. He knew I had been in the room. The next morning, he acted like nothing was wrong, but I could feel his eyes on me. I tried to go about my work, but my hands were shaking. I needed to get off the island, but the next supply boat wasn't due for a week. I stayed out of his way as much as possible, but he cornered me in the lab. "You've been snooping," he said. I tried to deny it, but he grabbed my arm. "You know too much. You're not leaving this island." I managed to break free and land to my cabin, locking the door behind me. I knew I had to find a way to call for help. There was a radio in the research station, but I needed a distraction. I remembered the flares we kept for emergencies and grabbed one. As night fell, I set off the flare near the edge of the island. It lit up the sky, and I heard Dr. Carlson cursing as he ran towards it. With him distracted, I dashed to the research station and grabbed the radio. I called for help, my voice shaking. "This is an emergency. I'm on island name with Dr. Carlson. He's conducting illegal experiments and is threatening me. Please, send help." I didn't know if anyone heard me, but I couldn't stay in the research station. I ran back to my cabin and barricaded the door. Hours passed in silence, and then I heard the sound of a helicopter. Relief washed over me. Dr. Carlson tried to stop them, but the authorities overpowered him. They found the evidence I had seen and more. He was arrested, and I was taken to safety. I learned later that he had been under suspicion for a while, but no one had been able to prove anything until now. It took me a long time to recover from that experience. I still love marine biology, but I'm much more careful about who I trust. That summer changed everything for me. I had signed up for a spiritual retreat in the dense forests of Oregon, hoping to find some peace and clarity. The retreat promised a week of meditation, nature walks, and self-discovery, and I was eager to escape the noise of everyday life. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The setting was beautiful, the air crisp and fresh, and the other participants seemed friendly enough. We were a small group, about 10 of us, and our guide, Martin, was this calm, soft-spoken man who seemed to have all the answers. He led us through meditation sessions, guided us on hikes, and spoke about finding inner peace. But as the days went on, I started noticing little things that felt off. The way Martin and some of the others exchanged glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, and the way they seemed to be keeping secrets. One evening, Martin announced that we would have a special ceremony in a clearing deep in the forest. He said it was a tradition of the retreat, something to help us connect with nature and each other. We gathered around a fire as the sun set, the sky turning dark. Martin began chanting in a language I didn't recognize, and the others joined in. I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. As the chanting grew louder, Martin produced a small vial of liquid and handed it to each of us, saying it would help us see the truth. I hesitated, but everyone else drank it without question. I pretended to drink mine and kept the liquid in my mouth, spitting it out when no one was looking. Almost immediately, the others began to act strange. Their eyes glazed over, and they moved in unison, like they were in a trance. Martin started talking about shedding our old selves and being reborn. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he knew I hadn't drunk the liquid. But then he turned his attention to the others, leading them in a strange dance around the fire. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to get out of there. I slipped away, moving quietly through the trees. The forest was dark and disorienting, and I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could still hear the chanting, growing fainter as I put more distance between us. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get away. After what felt like hours, I found myself at the edge of a small creek. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had seen. This wasn't just a retreat. It was something much darker. I had to warn the others, get help, but first, I needed to find my way out. I walked through the night, the forest seeming to close in around me. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that Martin or one of the others would appear at any moment. Finally, as dawn broke, I saw a road through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I followed the road until I came to a small town. Exhausted and dirty, I found a diner and stumbled inside. The waitress gave me a strange look but brought me a cup of coffee. I asked if there was a police station nearby, and she pointed me in the right direction. The officer on duty listened to my story with a skeptical expression but agreed to send someone to check it out. It took hours for them to find the clearing, and by then, it was empty. The fire was out, and there was no sign of Martin or the others. The officer looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I had seen. I knew they were out there, and that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I left Oregon the next day, still shaken and unsure of what I had stumbled into. The experience haunted me, and I couldn't stop thinking about the others. What had happened to them? Were they still out there, or had they moved on to another unsuspecting group? I would never know for sure, but I was grateful to have escaped with my life. Since then, I've been more cautious about where I go and who I trust. The memory of that night in the forest is always with me, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. I don't know if I'll ever find the peace I was looking for, but I'm thankful just to be alive. I was looking forward to a peaceful camping trip in the remote forests of Idaho, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the sounds of nature. But what I encountered there was far from peaceful. As the sun began to set, I settled into my campsite, eager to unwind after a long day of hiking through the wilderness. But as darkness fell, a sense of unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That's when I noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, coming closer and closer to my campsite. My heart began to race as I strained to listen for any sign of who, or what, was approaching. Suddenly, I heard the sound of someone fumbling with the door of my van, their movements quick and furtive. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to catch whoever was trying to break in. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I crept towards the van, trying to stay hidden in the shadows as I approached. But as I drew closer, I realized I was too late. The door was already open, swinging wide to reveal the dark interior of the vehicle. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do next. But as I listened to the sounds of someone rummaging through my belongings inside the van, I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to protect myself and my belongings. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged forward, grabbing hold of the intruder and pulling them out of the van with all the strength I could muster. They stumbled and fell to the ground, their face obscured by the darkness of the night. But as they scrambled to their feet and turned to face me, I recoiled in horror. It was a stranger, their face twisted into a mask of rage and desperation as they glared at me with wild eyes. I tried to reason with them, to ask them why they were trying to break into my van. But they were beyond reason, their mind consumed by some unseen force that drove them to madness. With a sickening realization, I knew I had to get away from this person as fast as I could. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush as I tried to put as much distance between me and the crazed intruder as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, they were always right behind me, their footsteps echoing through the forest as they pursued me with relentless determination. I ducked and dodged through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest as I desperately tried to lose them in the darkness. But they were always one step ahead of me, their presence looming over me like a shadow in the night. I stumbled and fell, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struggled to keep moving. But as I looked up, I saw the glint of moonlight on metal, a knife, held in the hand of the person who was chasing me. With a surge of fear unlike anything I had ever felt before, I pushed myself to my feet and kept running, driven by the primal instinct to survive at all costs. But just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I stumbled upon a clearing in the forest. Without hesitation, I dashed towards the safety of the open space, hoping against hope that I could find some way to escape my pursuer. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I came face to face with a sheer drop-off, a steep cliff that plummeted down into the darkness below. I skidded to a halt at the edge, my heart sinking as I realized I had nowhere left to run. With my back against the cliff, I turned to face my attacker, their crazed eyes burning with a manic intensity as they closed in on me with outstretched hands. In that moment, I knew I had to fight back with everything I had if I wanted to survive. With a scream of defiance, I launched myself at them, throwing punches and kicks with reckless abandon as I fought to defend myself against their onslaught. But they were too strong, overpowering me with ease as they pinned me to the ground with a vice-like grip. I struggled and thrashed, but it was no use. They had me trapped, at their mercy in the heart of the forest. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. I looked up to see a group of hikers emerging from the trees, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they hurried towards me. With a final burst of energy, I managed to break free from my attacker's grasp and scramble to my feet. The hikers wasted no time in coming to my aid, surrounding me and driving my attacker back with shouts and warnings. Together, we fled into the safety of the night, putting as much distance between us and my would-be assailant as possible. I went stealth camping in the forests of Northern California. It was something I had done before, parking my van off a remote dirt road, away from any signs of civilization. The quiet and solitude of the forest were perfect for clearing my mind. This particular spot was deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and dense underbrush. The day was uneventful. I spent it reading, taking short walks, and enjoying the peacefulness. As the sun set, the forest grew darker, and the sounds of nature became louder. I prepared a simple dinner inside the van, locking the doors as a precaution. The isolation felt comforting but also a bit eerie as night fell. Around midnight, I heard a faint knock on the side of the van. Startled, I froze, listening intently. The knock came again, louder this time. I got up cautiously and looked out the small window. A man stood there, looking disheveled and lost. "Hello? Can you help me?" "I'm lost," he called out, his voice shaky. I hesitated, considering my options. He didn't look threatening, but the situation felt off. Against my better judgment, I opened the window slightly. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "I've been wandering for hours. My car broke down, and I can't find my way back," he explained. He seemed desperate and scared. I decided to help but stay cautious. "Do you have a phone?" I asked. He shook his head. "No signal out here," he replied. I glanced at my phone and saw he was right. There was no service. I told him to wait while I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the van. The air was cool, and the forest was pitch dark. I kept a safe distance from the man as I spoke to him. "Where did you leave your car?" I asked. "Down the road, about a mile back," he said, pointing in a vague direction. "Can you give me a ride?" Something about his story didn't add up. Why would he be so far from his car in the middle of the night? But I couldn't leave him stranded if he was telling the truth. I decided to drive him to the nearest town, which was a good hour away. "Okay, get in," I said, opening the passenger door. He climbed in, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I started the van and began driving down the dark, narrow road. The man was quiet, staring straight ahead. After a few minutes, he spoke. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "It's dangerous," he said, his tone changing. There was something menacing in his voice now. I glanced at him, trying to stay calm. "I know how to take care of myself," I replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He smirked, and my heart started to race. Suddenly, he lunged at me, grabbing the wheel. The van swerved, and I struggled to maintain control. "What are you doing?" I shouted, trying to push him away. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his grip tightening. I fought back, elbowing him in the ribs. He grunted but didn't let go. The van careened off the road, crashing into a tree. The impact dazed me, but I managed to unbuckle my seatbelt and scramble out of the van. The man was right behind me. I ran into the forest, branches scratching my face and arms. The darkness was disorienting, but I kept moving, fueled by fear. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. I stumbled over a root and fell, pain shooting through my ankle. I forced myself up and limped forward, knowing I couldn't stop. In the distance, I saw a faint light. I headed towards it, praying it was a way out. The light grew brighter, and I realized it was another camper, a small fire burning outside a tent. I burst into the clearing, shouting for help. A man emerged from the tent, startled. "What's going on?" he asked. Before I could answer, my pursuer appeared, his face twisted with rage. "She's mine," he screamed, lunging at me again. The camper reacted quickly, tackling him to the ground. They struggled, and I grabbed a nearby branch, hitting my attacker with all my strength. He collapsed, unconscious. The camper looked at me, breathing heavily. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "We need to tie him up," I said, my voice shaking. He found some rope in his tent, and we secured the man, making sure he couldn't escape. I explained what had happened as we waited for dawn. As soon as the sun rose, we hiked back to my van. It was damaged but drivable. The camper helped me load the unconscious man into the back, and we headed to the nearest town, where we reported the incident to the authorities. The police took him into custody and listened to my story. They told me he was a known criminal, wanted for several assaults in the area. I was lucky to have escaped with my life. The experience left me shaken. I realized how vulnerable I had been, and it took a long time for me to feel safe again. I learned to trust my instincts and be more cautious when camping alone. The forest, once a place of solace, now felt haunted by the memory of that night. I still love the outdoors, but the sense of freedom was overshadowed by the fear of what could happen when you let your guard down. In the end, I was grateful for the camper who helped me and the lesson I learned. The world is full of dangers, and it's important to stay vigilant, even in places that seem peaceful and serene. My family decided to have a reunion at our lake house in Minnesota. It had been years since we were all together, and the idea of spending a week by the lake sounded perfect. The house was big, with plenty of rooms and a great view of the water. My grandfather, the family patriarch, was especially excited. He loved having everyone around. We arrived on a sunny afternoon, and everyone started catching up. There was a lot of laughter and good food. The first couple of days were relaxing. We swam, fished, and took long walks. Everything seemed perfect, but I noticed some tension between my Uncle Dave and my grandfather. They were often whispering in heated conversations. One evening, I couldn't sleep and went downstairs to get some water. As I walked past the study, I heard voices. My Uncle Dave was talking to someone on the phone. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to understand he was talking about my grandfather and money. He sounded angry and desperate. I felt a chill run down my spine but decided to keep quiet and go back to bed. The next day, things seemed normal, but I couldn't shake off what I heard. I started paying more attention to my uncle. He was always watching my grandfather, especially when he was near the lake. It made me uneasy. I confided in my cousin Sarah, and she told me she had also noticed something strange about Dave. We decided to keep an eye on him together. That night, we stayed up late, pretending to watch TV, but really, we were listening for anything unusual. Around midnight, we heard the back door creak open. We peeked out the window and saw Dave heading towards the lake. We followed him quietly, staying hidden in the shadows. He stopped at the dock and pulled out a small bottle from his pocket, pouring its contents into my grandfather's drink bottle that he always took on his morning walks. My heart was racing. We ran back to the house and debated what to do. We couldn't confront him without proof, and we didn't want to cause a scene without being sure. We decided to wait until morning and warn my grandfather. At dawn, we found my grandfather in the kitchen, getting ready for his walk. We told him what we saw, and he was shocked but believed us. He asked us to stay quiet and let him handle it. He took his drink bottle and walked out as usual, but instead of heading to the lake, he went to my dad's room and showed him the bottle. My dad took the bottle to a friend in town who worked at a lab. By afternoon, we had confirmation. The bottle contained poison. My grandfather called a family meeting, and with everyone gathered, he confronted Dave. At first, Dave denied everything, but when my dad showed him the lab results, he broke down and confessed. He admitted he was in serious debt and needed the inheritance. The police were called, and Dave was taken away. The family was in shock. We never imagined something like this could happen. My grandfather was shaken but relieved that we had stopped Dave before he could do anything worse. The rest of the reunion was somber. We all felt the weight of what could have happened. My grandfather was grateful to us for paying attention and acting on our instincts. The family came together in a way we hadn't before, supporting each other through the ordeal. I left the lake house with a mix of emotions. The place I always associated with happy memories now had a dark shadow over it. But I also felt a strong bond with my family, knowing we had protected one another. Last summer, I rented a cabin in the Adirondacks for a week. I needed to get away from everything, and the mountains seemed like the perfect place. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by trees and not too far from a small lake. It was exactly what I was looking for, peace and quiet. The first couple of days were great. I spent my time hiking, swimming in the lake, and just relaxing on the porch with a book. I barely saw anyone else. It was like having my own private retreat. The cabin itself was cozy, with a small kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom upstairs. On the third day, I decided to do some cleaning. I was wiping down the living room when I noticed something odd. There was a small hole in the bookshelf, just above eye level. I looked closer and saw a tiny lens inside. It was a camera. My heart started pounding. I quickly checked the rest of the room and found another one behind a picture frame on the wall. I felt sick. Someone had been watching me. I tried to stay calm and think. I needed to check the rest of the cabin. I went upstairs to the bedroom and found another camera in the smoke detector. The bathroom had one too, hidden in the vent. There was even one in the kitchen, inside a clock on the wall. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I thought about driving there, but my car was parked outside in plain view. Whoever was watching might see me leaving. I felt trapped. I decided to pack my things quietly, hoping to leave without drawing attention. As I was stuffing my clothes into my bag, I heard a knock at the door. My blood ran cold. I peeked out the window and saw the landlord standing on the porch. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, and he looked friendly enough when I first met him. But now, knowing he'd been spying on me, he seemed sinister. I didn't answer the door. I just stood there, frozen, hoping he would go away. After a few minutes, he knocked again, harder this time. "Is everything all right in there?" he called out. His voice sounded concerned, but I didn't trust it. I stayed silent. Eventually, he left, but I knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my bag and crept out the back door, staying low. I made my way through the trees, heading toward the main road. It was a long walk, but I hoped I could find a signal and call for help. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the landlord following me. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. The sun was setting, and the woods were getting darker. I finally reached the road and started walking toward the town. It was another few miles, but I had no other choice. After about an hour, I saw headlights coming up the road. I waved my arms, hoping it was someone who could help. The car slowed down and stopped. A middle-aged couple was inside. I told them what happened, and they immediately called the police. They let me sit in their car while we waited for the officers to arrive. The police came and took my statement. They went back to the cabin with me and found the cameras. They arrested the landlord that night. It turned out he had been renting the cabin for years and had been spying on all his guests. There were dozens of recordings on his computer. The whole experience left me shaken. I thought I was going to have a relaxing week in the mountains, but it turned into a nightmare. I still have trouble sleeping, thinking about those cameras and how he watched my every move. I packed up my old sedan, filled it with snacks, water, and some camping gear, and hit the road. The desert was vast and empty, the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts. I had been driving for hours when I saw a figure on the side of the road, thumb out, looking desperate. At first, I was hesitant to stop. You hear so many stories about picking up strangers, but something about this guy made me pull over. He looked rough, dirty, and scared. He got in the car without saying much. Just thanked me and asked if I could take him as far as I was going. I nodded and we drove in silence for a while. His name was Jake, and he was jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder. After about an hour, he started to open up. He told me he was running from a gang. He had gotten involved with them, and now they wanted him dead. I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't give too many details, but it was clear he was in serious trouble. We drove for a few more hours, and as the sun started to set, I began looking for a place to camp for the night. I found a small, deserted rest stop with a few picnic tables and an old, run-down bathroom. It seemed as good a place as any to stop. We set up a small camp, and I shared some of my food with Jake. He seemed more relaxed, but I could tell he was still on edge. As night fell, the desert became eerily quiet. We sat by a small fire, the only light in the vast darkness. Around midnight, I heard the sound of engines in the distance. Jake's face went pale. "They're coming," he whispered. "We need to hide." We quickly put out the fire and grabbed our stuff. There was an old building nearby, maybe an abandoned service station. We ran inside and hid behind some rusted equipment. The engines got louder, and soon I saw headlights sweeping across the desert. A few trucks pulled up to the rest stop. Men got out, armed and looking angry. They started searching the area, shouting Jake's name. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. Jake was shaking beside me, his eyes wide with terror. One of the men kicked over the picnic table we had been sitting at. "He can't be far," he growled. They spread out, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they found us. We needed a plan. I whispered to Jake that we should try to make a run for the car. He nodded, and we waited until the men were on the other side of the rest stop. We moved as quietly as we could, slipping out of the building and heading towards the car. We were almost there when one of them spotted us. "There they are," he shouted. We sprinted the last few yards to the car, bullets whizzing past us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, but managed to get the door open. We jumped in, and I started the engine, flooring it as we sped away. The trucks gave chase, their headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. The road was rough, and the car bounced and swerved as I tried to keep control. Jake was shouting directions, telling me to take turns onto smaller roads, hoping to lose them in the maze of desert trails. We drove for what felt like hours, the trucks slowly falling behind. Finally, we found a narrow, rocky path that the trucks couldn't follow. I kept driving until we were sure we had lost them. We stopped in a secluded spot, hidden by rocks and scrub. Both of us were panting, drenched in sweat. We stayed there until dawn, too scared to move. When the sun rose, we cautiously made our way back to the main road. We didn't talk much after that. I drove Jake to the nearest town, where he said he had friends who could help him. He thanked me, genuinely grateful, and disappeared into the crowd. I continued my road trip, but the rest of the journey felt different. The desert wasn't as peaceful anymore, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I got back home, I realized how close I had come to something truly dangerous. I still think about Jake sometimes, wondering if he ever found safety or if the gang caught up to him. I decided to take a solo backpacking trip in the Black Forest in Germany. It was a place I'd always wanted to visit. I started my hike early in the morning, excited about the adventure ahead. The forest was beautiful, dense with trees and full of the sounds of nature. I felt free and alive, enjoying every step of the way. Around midday, I stopped for a break near a small stream. While I was eating, I noticed a man on the trail. He looked like he was also hiking, carrying a backpack and dressed in outdoor gear. At first, I thought nothing of it. People hike all the time, right? But as I resumed my hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. I kept moving, trying to stay ahead. Every time I looked back, he was there, keeping pace with me. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was a coincidence. But the unease grew as the hours passed. By late afternoon, I was sure he was following me on purpose. My heart started racing, and I quickened my pace. As the sun began to set, I decided to set up camp. I found a small clearing, hoping he would just pass by and leave me alone. But as I was pitching my tent, he appeared at the edge of the clearing. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. I forced myself to stay calm, finishing my tent and pretending not to notice him. He finally approached, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He asked if he could share my campsite since it was getting dark. I didn't want to seem rude or scared, so I agreed, but my gut told me this was a mistake. He set up his tent a little too close to mine for comfort. We sat by the fire, making small talk. He said his name was Klaus and that he was also backpacking solo. But something about his story didn't add up. His eyes never seemed to leave me, and his smile was unsettling. The tension in the air was thick. I barely touched my dinner, too nervous to eat. When it was time to sleep, I crawled into my tent, every instinct telling me to stay awake. I heard him moving around outside, the sound of footsteps circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, hoping he would just go to sleep. But the sounds didn't stop. Instead, they got closer. Suddenly, my tent zipper started to open. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the only thing I had for protection, a small camping knife. I didn't want to use it, but I was terrified. Klaus's face appeared in the opening, his expression twisted with something like anger or frustration. He said he wanted to talk, but his tone was menacing. I yelled at him to get away, holding the knife out in front of me. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and told me I was overreacting. But I could see the shift in his eyes, the way his smile faded. He wasn't going to leave me alone. My hands were shaking, but I knew I had to do something. I lunged at him with the knife, hoping to scare him off. He jumped back, surprised, but then his face twisted with rage. He grabbed my wrist, trying to wrestle the knife away from me. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, desperate to get him away. In the chaos, I managed to cut his arm. He yelled in pain, loosening his grip. I took my chance and bolted out of the tent, running into the dark forest. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, cursing and shouting. I ran until my lungs burned, and I couldn't hear him anymore. I found a thick cluster of bushes and crawled inside, trying to catch my breath. I stayed hidden, listening for any sign of him. Hours seemed to pass, the forest eerily silent. I was too scared to move, too scared to sleep. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. I cautiously emerged from my hiding place, my body aching and exhausted. I knew I had to find help, get back to civilization. I retraced my steps as best as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. It took most of the day, but I finally found my way back to a main trail. I flagged down the first hikers I saw, a group of friends who were startled by my appearance. They helped me to the nearest town, where I told the authorities everything. They took my report and assured me they would look for Klaus. I was shaken, but relieved to be safe. I was camping in the forests of northern Michigan, seeking solace amidst the towering trees and tranquil wilderness. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, just me and the sounds of nature surrounding my van. But when I woke up, I found myself in the middle of a nightmare. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I stirred from my sleep, blinking away the remnants of a restless night. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized something was wrong. There were voices outside, low and guttural, interspersed with the snap of twigs and the rustle of leaves. Heart pounding, I peered out the window of my van and saw them, a group of men, dressed in camouflage and brandishing rifles, surrounding my campsite. Fear clutched at my chest as I realized I was surrounded, trapped in my own little slice of wilderness. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront them? Or should I stay hidden inside my van and hope they went away? My mind raced with fear and uncertainty as I weighed my options. But before I could make a decision, one of the men spotted me. He shouted something to the others, and suddenly they were closing in, their faces twisted with anger and hostility. I panicked, scrambling to lock the doors of my van as they pounded on the windows, demanding that I come out. I felt like a trapped animal, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched frantically for a way out. But there was nowhere to run. The men had surrounded my van, cutting off any possible escape routes. I was completely at their mercy, and I didn't know what they were capable of. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, one of the men produced a shotgun from his pack and aimed it at my van. My blood ran cold as I realized they were serious, that they were willing to use violence to get me out. I didn't know what to do. Should I try to reason with them? Or should I fight back and risk getting hurt? My mind raced with fear and indecision as I tried to come up with a plan. But before I could make a decision, the situation took an unexpected turn. From out of nowhere, a voice called out from the trees, clear and commanding. It was a park ranger, drawn by the commotion. He demanded to know what was going on, and the men reluctantly backed off, their anger tempered by the presence of authority. I breathed a sigh of relief as the ranger approached my van, his expression stern but sympathetic. He listened as I explained what had happened, and he assured me that I was safe now, that he would take care of everything. As the men slunk away into the forest, their anger replaced by sullen resentment, the ranger helped me pack up my things and escorted me out of the woods. I was shaken but unharmed, grateful to be alive. But as I drove away from that place, the memory of what had happened lingered in my mind, a dark shadow cast over the beauty of the forest. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, just me and my trusty camper van in the Texas Hill Country. But as the sun set and darkness fell over the landscape, things took a sinister turn. I had parked in a secluded spot, surrounded by rolling hills and towering trees. The night air was still and quiet, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't shake. As I settled in for the night, I heard the sound of voices in the distance. At first, I thought it might be other campers passing by, but as the voices grew louder, I realized something was wrong. Peering out the window of my van, I saw a group of men approaching. They were loud and boisterous, their laughter echoing through the night air. But there was something about their demeanor that set off alarm bells in my mind. I tried to ignore them, to pretend like I hadn't noticed their presence, but they had other ideas. They began to circle my van, shouting insults and banging on the doors. I felt a surge of fear rising in my chest as I realized I was trapped. These men weren't just passing through, they were intent on causing trouble. I tried to reason with them, to explain that I just wanted to be left alone, but they wouldn't listen. They grew increasingly aggressive, their voices turning into shouts and their gestures becoming more threatening. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what these men were capable of, and the thought of confronting them filled me with dread. But just as things seemed like they couldn't get any worse, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. I held my breath, hoping against hope that it was someone coming to help me. And then, like a guardian angel, a park ranger emerged from the darkness. He was tall and imposing, his presence commanding respect. He quickly assessed the situation and ordered the men to leave. At first, they resisted, but when they saw the ranger's badge glinting in the moonlight, they knew they didn't stand a chance. Reluctantly, they backed away, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had come. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. The park ranger stayed with me until dawn, making sure I was safe and reassuring me that he would keep an eye on the area. I thanked him profusely, grateful for his intervention. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I packed up my things and drove away from that cursed spot as fast as I could. The memory of that terrifying night would stay with me forever, but I knew that I had survived thanks to the timely intervention of the park ranger. Now, as I sit in the safety of my home, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if he hadn't come when he did.